Greetings and salutations. You are listening to the Into the North podcast, where we take a look at the competitive side of the Commander format, also known as CEDH. I am not your so frequent host, Null, aka Matt, and today we have the fourth installment of the special episode series, where we'll be taking a deep dive into Mono U and more specifically Urza. Of course, I am joined by three special guests, Eisenherz, Keegan, and Sinivi. So why don't we start by introducing ourselves? Specifically, tell us a bit about like how you got into CDH and also how you picked up Blue/Urza.
Okay, should I start?
Yeah.
So my name is Eisenherz. I'm from Germany. I used to play Standard or T2 competitively around Onslaught and Mirrodin and the original Ravnica block. And then I stopped playing Magic for over 10 years. I just got back into it last year, played some Pauper, saw that EDH was the new big thing, and then, yeah, just started from there, build a casual deck, and made it high-powered. Yeah, and then just started to play Urza because I found him so interesting.
Hello,
Nice.
my name is Keegan, and I've been playing Magic since 7th edition, where I played mostly kitchen table Magic. When I went off to university, some friends picked it up, and naturally I said, oh, I've got some of that in an old box, brought it out, and realized how bad I was. From then, I played iteratively Standard during the heydays of win-con-less blue-white control with Elixir of Immortality. When all of that rotated out, I switched to Modern, where I played Jeskai control, which I enjoyed immensely, before I discovered EDH and loved the variability of it, and played a great deal with many of my friends, colleagues, and coworkers before stumbling into CEDH in large part due to the interaction I had with the host of these podcasts. So thank you for showing me that.
Yeah.
And since then, I've exclusively played Mono Blue CEDH and have immensely enjoyed it.
Nice.
Cool. So I'm Sinivi. I have been playing Magic, I don't know, since I was a small child. I think, similar to Keegan, maybe around 7th edition. I think the first set that I remember buying boosters of was actually Judgment. But I played a lot through college, and I played a lot of Vintage. So I grew up in the Northeast, and in the Northeast, the NYSE scene was pretty strong when I was in college, and there were a lot of Vintage circuit tournaments, and I spent a lot of time playing very aggressive, like Drain Tendrils kinds of decks, a lot of Painter's Servant, a lot of Vault Key stuff, but Blue has always been something that I've played a lot of, and as as EDH became more popular, I found myself in a lot of games where I was doing things that the other players were just not very happy with. Like specifically playing very aggressive cards or very redundant combos or easily tutored combos. So for a while there was this sort of, and I don't know how many of the rest of the people in this podcast remember this time of EDH. Those were dark days, but the format was like new enough that CDH wasn't really a thing, and there was this like constant friction around how high powered you were allowed to play whatever deck you were playing, and I tended to always fall on the very lean, low to the ground, high interaction, infinite combo side of the format. So I've been playing Mono Blue for a long time, and it just it was a pretty easy transition from playing Vintage into CDH, and I've always had some form of a Mono Blue CDH deck together.
Nice. I think one thing about Mono Blue that is funny is like a lot of the Mono Blue players like are very strict to the Mono Blue rule, or like when you kind of catch like, I don't know, the Mono Blue fever, you can't really shake it. And I'm sure Keegan's going to talk about that 100%.
It's a lifestyle, not a deck choice.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll be starting by going over kind of the history and philosophy of Mono Blue in general. As I said, but we will be moving into Urza and kind of the nitty-gritty as far as the card selection, piloting advice, and of course questions from the listeners and other hot takes, So do you guys want to give your shot at maybe kind of just talking about how Mono Blue works in CDH?
Wait. If you're gonna say it works badly.
So I think the best thing we have going for us, of course, is free interaction. So that's what gets added into every other deck that plays blue. But the other thing we have is the strong synergy with artifacts. So we have like very good artifact tutors, and I think that's what the core of Mono Blue does. So heavy interaction plus very synergistic with artifacts, and that's what draws me towards playing Mono Blue the most.
There's a huge part of Mono Blue's identity, which is defined by its symbiosis with artifacts. And I think Mono Blue is best defined not by what it does well, but actually what it does poorly. And it mana ramps exceptionally poorly. With the single exceptions of ritual mana in the form of High Tide, there's very little ability for the color to get ahead on mana. And so baked into that is a reliance on the fast mana rocks. What this does mean is that much of the power of Mono Blue decks come from older printed cards. You're highly reliant on things like Mana Crypt, Grim Monolith, and what have you, things that are unlikely to see more printings, as well as many of the most broken blue cards, because naturally having access to a much smaller card pool means that you're limited to playing only really the best of these types of effects, which are rarely reprinted again. So while there is a discrepancy in power level between Mono Blue and some of the 4 and 5 color deck options that you can have, this has continued to widen and will likely, that gap will become greater and greater as time goes on as a function of the printing of commander specific cards.
I think, just to add on to that, I think that in addition to the ramp aspect, the synergy with artifacts and the reliance on and necessity of artifacts making Mono Blue a viable archetype also includes the fact that many of our best tutors are artifact-specific tutors, right? Like even the cards that we have that can find things which are not artifacts, don't put them into play, and generally will require more mana investment to have an immediate impact on the game, whereas things like Transmute Artifact can immediately put a relevant to everyone's stacks piece or effect onto the board, like Torpor Orb. And I think that that is a very, very, very compelling reason to be building around artifacts in Mono Blue, especially. I think then you have also the obvious piece, which is the fact that we interact well with the stack. It's no secret to anyone. You play this format, decks are low to the ground. They do a lot of interaction on the stack. Blue is exceptionally good at this. But I think that the relationship it has to artifacts is the primary reason you would play a Mono Blue deck, because all of the free interaction that you have with the stack, many of the other archetypes in the format just jam anyway. So it's one of those things where I don't think it's really like a either or both thing. I think it's the only real reason to play a Mono Blue deck in CEDH is because of the things that you could do with artifacts.
Yeah, I think that was all well said. I guess before we move into the history, is there anything else you'd like to say? All right. Okay. So let's move into the history of Mono Blue, and I think it's great to encapsulate the history before we go into specifically Urza, because there has been a lot of development over the past, 6+ years, at least as far as when I've been playing, that is important to bring up. So what are the other Mono Blue commanders?
Okay, so
I'm sorry. Did someone say that there were other Mono Blue commanders? I don't believe you. To be, and I think I don't believe you.
There was definitely more of a discussion on that before the printing of Urza specifically, but
so I gotta be honest. So as I'm fairly new to EDH and CEDH, I haven't played a lot of other commanders, and the only one that really had an impact on me and I really liked playing was Memnarch, who is definitely not CEDH viable, even though people try to make him that. And the reason I played him is because he synergizes with artifacts, and that's what I like. And then other than that, I can't tell really. I've played against Teferi, I've played against Narumeha, I've played against Jace, but I don't think that any of these was as good or as how would you say it, consistent as Urza is.
There's a number of potential CEDH blue decks. They're not as good, so I think it's fair to say that if
potential and strong air quotes.
Yeah, if you want the best option, I don't think it's as much of an interesting discussion. But I would not look down on any deck which ran quite a number of different commanders. I've seen viable options of course, Urza, both versions of Teferi, Neruhumeha, both versions of God Kevnit, Eternal. I mean, hell, Thada Del, Jace. There's an Arkham list Rip, even Thibblefip and Emery. And I would categorize these into perhaps 3 different groups. So there's those that have exceptional artifact-based synergies. Naturally, something like Arkham, Urza, and Teferi would fall into this category. So they're encouraging you to make artifact-based synergies baked into the deck. And then there's those which have the commander act as part of a very compact combo. So something like Neruhumeha would fall under that category, and to have a bit of overlap with the other section, Teferi as well. And the last are those which offer card advantage in the command zone. And it's this last group which I think are the least viable, because they don't differentiate themselves well from commanders which would have a larger and wider color identity. While the card advantage of Jace, Fringe Prodigy, or Azami is nothing to sniff at, if you're going to be doing that, why not just play Timna Thrasios and draw more cards, right? So I think that if we're going to talk of blue and what would justify you sort of tying one of your hands behind your back to play a monocolored strategy, I think that you need to pick what it does best, which is, again, artifact synergies and having a commander which can be included as part of your win condition.
Yeah, and even in regards to like the mono blue commanders that do generate advantage, to be completely honest about it, even if Thrasios or Timna were mono blue, they'd be doing a better job than a lot of these commanders that had card advantage.
You're telling me that Fibblefip's draw 1 card isn't sufficient card advantage for a 2-draw?
I don't think we're quite at the density of win conditions in mono blue to really say that, but
I mean, even I don't know.
So we do have a list of descending strength, and I think it's important that we go over, maybe talk specifically about the list, and also that the controversy in regards to which commanders are in which places. So of course at the top it starts with Urza. I don't think anyone's really questioning that, and we will go into why that is later for sure. But I think let's leave that discussion. So who wants to read off the next one? Okay,
so the next one is Neruhumeha. And I have to say that I do not agree with that, because I think she's, how would you say it in English? When the combo's coming, almost every time.
It's telegraphed.
Yeah, it's very telegraphed, and you can interact with it. And then it's also very expensive to combo off, so people are going to be ready for it. And every time I've seen her in pods, she pretty much got smoked. That's my experience with earlier, seeing other people play.
When Keegan was talking earlier about having a compact combo in the command zone, and I was looking at this list, and Neruhumeha is second, I was like, compact? What? You have to find these instants that like Glowsly Flicker, and you have to have an outlet, or it doesn't really do anything. And first of all, you already, if you're playing mono blue, you're already kind of low on card quality in many circumstances, so having to play shit like Ghostly Flicker and Illusionist Stratagem is not amazing. Even if it does combo with your commander, you then also need an outlet, and finding and putting together all of those things with the card selection that we have is not especially likely. And that doesn't even get into... I mean, look, the number of games that I've played in the last 6 months where I could have reasonably sat around and interacted and held up 7 mana waiting to win is I can probably count them on one hand. I just don't think this is a very good deck, if I'm being super direct.
There's some real drawbacks to Neruhumeha, especially given that unlike a similar deck in Teferi being involved in the combo, she has little utility outside of it. It's unlikely that you'll pay 4 mana for a fork effect. To speak to some of the strengths of that deck, would be naturally the win condition is instant speed, which is highly relevant, although as you point out, it's often foreseeable, especially because your tutors to find your ghostly flicker they'll be telegraphed, right? You'll be able to see for it, and then holding up the 7 mana is necessary. In terms of actually on board, what you have to be telegraph on board, it's much less, which is one of her advantages. Really, you just need lands to cast it. Technically, you could win from nothing but that, generate infinite mana, and then use your Blue Sun Zenith to knock everybody out. I don't think it's exactly fair to call it a 2-card win condition, because although Neromeha in your commander you always have access to, Ghostly Flicker you'd have to tutor for, you still need to have an outlet, and this is an advantage that is unique to Urza and Teferi, them being able to both generate infinite mana as well as draw/cast your whole deck is pretty big. Included at number 2, I think, is perhaps controversial. I know Teferi has gotten a lot more testing, but she is perhaps she stands out as unique in that Artifact 8 is something which she dances around very nicely. While Urza is okay at Artifact 8, against Artifact 8, it still has to play a lot of it, and it can execute some of its combos even with that out. Neromeha really is only hated on by, of course, rule of law effects as well as counter spells, but isn't. And then lastly, if someone were to heinously just pressure your life total and draw cards and never let you do nothing and cast 7 mana, she's pretty weak to that too. So her backup plan is pretty bad, but she happens to be a little more resilient, as well as being able to operate at instant speed is useful.
I think it's useful to move to the next one, because I think that there's a piece here that is about why Urza is relevant and good, that includes resource denial and playing a general, like a stacks strategy or sub-theme, which is very material in evaluating, the relevance of the deck, that I want to kind of get to, because I think it is what I would say is the primary argument for why you should not play something like Narumeha if you're playing mono blue. So the next general on this list is Chainveil Teferi, or Teferi the Planeswalker, and I think I kind of agree with this one being either second or third. I don't know what else you'd put second, but the reason is because mono blue and the format itself is legitimately a turn 3 format. Trying to build a turn 3 mono blue EDH deck is aspirational at best. Let's say that, right? Like, it's aspirational. And when you're the entire meta revolves around these ultra fast dockside strategies, which, by the way, take advantage of the fact that we have to rely on artifacts to do literally fucking anything. You kind of realize very quickly that going fast is never going to be the thing which is MO number 1. So the long and short of that becomes that these mana denial and disruptive strategies get much better, because there is no real version of reality in which you can go faster than the rest of the format. So Chainveil Teferi and Urza, in my opinion, sort of shake out and bubble up to the top as the two kind of premier ways of approaching that specific problem, in that they greatly facilitate your ability to break parity on stacks effects and play a disruptive strategy in ways that many of the other generals just don't provide.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
I might rate Chainveil Teferi slightly lower than some of the other cards on this list, even though I think it's necessary to pay homage to what was for a long time the premier mono blue strategy, and its drop off in power level I think is highly related to the number of creatures that are around. Whereas it might have been possible before to use Teferi as card advantage and mana ramp, now there is little to no chance that you'll be able to resolve a Teferi and have it live to see another turn cycle. And if it's to die and go from 6 to 8 mana to recast, it really limits your ability to combo I know, Matt, that you had played this deck for a long time, and in our discussions, I believe characterizing it as a mid-range deck was not was not incorrect, given how it needed to use its commander for advantage sometimes and basically do nothing, pursue its game plan, trade resources, and then go for it. But I believe in 2016, everything changed. You can't do that anymore. There's so many creatures around for Tymna's, and it's impossible to keep up for the late game card advantage. What other folks have mentioned here is entirely right. You need to be able to draw the game a little bit longer because mono blue can't win as quickly. However, you can't draw it into a symmetric late game. You can't just have everyone allowed to pursue their game plan and know that your mono blue strategy will outcard advantage people, as despite popular opinion, especially amongst more casual players, that mono blue is the epitome of control. Decks nowadays are entirely unable to pursue that, and those that pursue it well are the ones that have access to more sources of card advantage than mono blue could ever hope to.
I want to talk specifically about the creature problem as well. Like to put it like succinctly, like Teferi's biggest weakness is that it doesn't have 3 toughness, and I think the largest one of the great improvements you get from Urza from Teferi is that you get 2 creatures with more than 3 toughness. So in 2016 when we got partners, absolutely everything changed with Tymna.
I think also
which
there's
kind of
something
puts
to be.
God Eternal Kefnet in my mind maybe above Teferi in the sense, because can that creature block?
I mean I agree with that also, just because of the Crom problem. Like what the hell, if you're playing a Planeswalker as a commander, like how do you deal with Crom? Right, like
you don't.
You can't cast Teferi until you have the rest of your combo in your
hand.
Which
is really, that's so bad.
Which is a huge stipulation.
Yeah, that's so bad.
Yeah, the only card in the deck that actually gives you the opportunity to play on multiple turns is like Whir of Invention, and from like the artifact into play tutor sense, like it's probably one of the weaker ones.
Well, I think we can see that given how closely Whir of Invention compares to something like Court of Calling, and how rarely we see something like Court of Calling being limited to monocolored decks as well, as mono blue players, we're thankful for any scraps of tutors that we do get. So it happens to be premier amongst us, but in the context of quality tutors, not so much.
Wait, maybe we should put this in the section about single card discussion, because I actually don't agree with the Whir of Invention thing, and it's kind of a broader point for me. Like, giving away information is bad in this deck, and Whir of Invention lets you keep information hidden and do things like oopsie a stacks effect that obviates whatever someone was trying to do, right? Like Whir of Invention into Pithing Needle shuts down a lot of shit. Whir of Invention into Torpor Orb, like oopsie barfs on Dockside. So like I really like that aspect of playing mono blue, but I think it seems like more like it belongs in the single card discussion section.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I think we have a very complete list of the remaining. I just want to mention some commanders that have, I think, historically been considered the best at one point, and due to various circumstances, and I would say that those would be Arkham and like the kind of the high power sense Azami. But if you guys have points on the other ones, then let's absolutely bring them up.
No, I totally agree.
Arkham.
So at this point, I wouldn't play any other mono blue deck, honestly. Like Azami's cool because she's got the tribal thing going on, which is interesting, but it's not a thing a lot of people consider in CDH. And then Arkham, of course, it's like Sinovi already said, he's dead since Pension Ban.
Yeah. God, Rip,
that was a tough
I just need to say this, but like Arkham, God, I really loved Arkham because I just, in general, like I play a lot of disruptive and stacks decks in CDH, and I really miss playing a deck that could both be stacks and just force everyone to have it or you would win. This card is really a lot like Hermit Druid in that way. You know, like you run out Arkham and everyone knows if no one finds an answer, you will win if you on top with Arkham, right?
Yep.
Like, I loved that aspect of that deck, and I was so sad because without Pension, it really is just not the same thing.
And Arkham was I think considered like one of the best decks even before Pension, due to like I don't know exactly yet, but like the Dark Steel Citadel type combo where you can clear the board, and it's still in that sense
Disc and Forge,
and still in that sense like sorry, not Citadel. It's still in that sense like it is an untap and win deck, so you can definitely steal games in that sense. All right,
I have some. I mean, it goes without saying that Paradox Engine hurt is a lot of decks, the banning of that, but Mono Blue got it kind of bad, especially because two of its decks in Arkham Dagson and Emery are viable with it and less so without it. My issue with Arkham mostly relates to how slot intensive the combo has to be. If someone counters your Arkham a couple times, and I'm looking at a hand that includes Memnite and Sentinel Flute, I'm not super happy. And
what do you mean? Come on, man! Sentinel Flute is amazing. Sentinel Flute,
dude. You're gonna be happy you have all those 0-cost creatures when you Gilded Drake someone's Timna. Just saying.
So it requires you to play what I think could generously be called air and callously called garbage. So I don't love that because it already leans into what Mono Blue already has a problem with, which is highly commander-centric strategies. You really need the commander to be in play to do anything, and you can do little nothing without it. I think it's also fair to make specific reference to Jace and the aforementioned and mocked Fibblethip, because both of those, they have entrance on the Decklist database. There are people who play them. I consider them CDH decks, but they have pretty inherent problems. The problem with Jace being that the High Tide combo that it's trying to pursue is not actively great, and it itself as a one-time Snapcaster Mage and sometimes Merfolk Looter is not enough card advantage to warrant its slot, really. And then with Fibblethip being literally 2-mana draw 1 outside of your Polymorph combo, and at the time that you're pursuing a Polymorph combo, why choose that as your commander? And then, I don't know, I've given a try to, I think all of these decks at one point, definitely played the most CVT and Azami, but they just don't stack up. They don't stack up because Urza has facets. Also, he is better than them because he circumvents some of the artifact reliance, which I mentioned was an advantage for Narumeha, but he just gets to do that kind of for free, which is huge.
Yeah, the number of times I've seen people try to like windmill slam Null Rod like it's going to end your game, and then just like you play around it because Urza's not an artifact is kind of amazing. This
is something which is going to likely be an expanded conversation later, but to make specific mention to it now, I think that as hard as Urza is to play, it is much more difficult to play against, but that doesn't mean that when you play against it, you're not going to have it lose, but there is an overestimation often on what you might be capable of. I had the privilege recently to play with some of the Team Turn 3 people, and Reed looked at my board and said, well, I guess he might just win. And I looked at my board and I had 2 lands and Urza in play, and thought to myself, well, I hope so, but I don't know how we're getting there.
That is so true. Oh my god, the threat assessment.
If you want to be feared, Urza is a good deck to play, but it requires a little bit of CEDH specific knowledge to play around in such a way as to not overvalue its strength, and as a consequence, sort of give free wins to other decks.
Yeah. I agree.
Also, just as a tiny aside, because some people play this type of thing, there are a number of mono blue decks which are very good in limited circumstances, that being when you can't get your other 2 friends to show up. So if you play something like Baral, Venser, Vendilion Click, or Talrand, they can all have legs and play a meaningful game in 1v1, but with 4 players, it drops off dramatically. So that would be something.
The real strength of exactly. Vendilion Click. Honestly, I played a lot of Vendilion Click, to be truthful, in the past, especially like I was talking about earlier. Playing games of CEDH before it was a format and making everyone salty. I used to play Vendilion Click and Tunnel Vision, and that really upset people. Like the fact that your general plus tunnel vision was a combo was like very upsetting for a lot of people. Like when the format was kind of more fledgling. But the Vendilion Click heads up is also just so powerful because it gives you this ability to just say no to, from the command zone at any time, something that your opponent is doing. And when there's only one of them, that is amazing. When there are three, it's not great.
It's a bit tougher, yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up the history for sure of Mono Blue. We have some other honorable mentions that may not have come up, so I'll just list through those and then let's move on. So we have Empress Galena, of course. We have Kefnet the Mindful, Creature Teferi, and that's a Deep Dwelling, all of which, okay, Arcanist for sure, all of which have, can certainly steal games in like high power context and definitely represent Mono Blue well, but maybe don't quite make the cut in CDH.
So, yeah. Shout out to Creature Teferi, also playing one of my other favorite cards, which is Knowledge Pool.
Yeah, Creature Teferi is rude. Yeah, let's move on to the history of Urza. So to start things off, why don't we just talk about how what kind of adaptations we've taken from Teferi as kind of being the previous Mono Blue staple.
Well, can we just start with the Blocks Timna meme? Because this comes up, I feel like, with everything about the format. Like, people see something with a 3-bot, and they're like, oh my god, Blocks Timna! Yes! Stuff it! Jam it! And I'm like, as much as I hate that meme, it is kind of true here. Like, the fact that your general has a 4-bot and blocks most of the relevant things that would be trying to attack you is pretty awesome. The construct also does this in most circumstances, and like, I think blocking is just actually relevant these days, and that's great because we have a 4-bot.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And also, over the course of a game, Urza is certainly prone to removal, and casting Urza again to get another construct, and even playing into that, can really clog the board up, and which is great for the late game. So one thing too that Urza has over Teferi is its resilience to artifact hate. Does anyone want to go into that?
Okay, so the interesting thing is, like, a lot of artifact hate is based on denying artifact activations. So we have Null Rod and Collector Oof. And the best thing about Urza is that he can tap artifacts to produce mana himself, so we don't use the activated ability of the artifact, which makes the deck kind of resistant to that kind of artifact hate. And we can also... Yeah, so the main issue, at least in UPS, is that we kind of need to get rid of that artifact hate the turn we want to combo off. Because our best combos are... Well, the obvious combos are based on activated abilities of artifacts, being Ice-Crown Scepter and Grim Monolith.
And just because we haven't talked about this yet, there's kind of two builds of this list. One of them being the what Eisenhurst refers to as UPS, and the other being what we refer to as Bouncy Boy or Tidespout Tyrant. I think that this thing where you just get to sidestep a lot of artifact specific hate until you're ready to actually transact the win is very, very good. Being reliant or behest to having to play around that or through it before you can even go off is not so good. And I think that's the place that Teferi really stumbles. Someone jams an Elrod and you can't remove it, and then you're just kind of out of the game because you don't do anything else.
Blue does not have direct artifact destruction. Like, if you really want to deal with, or in creatures for that matter, if you really want to deal with something, you need to first bounce it and then counter it. So being in a situation where you have to 1 for 2, but also be in a multiplayer game really puts you back tremendously. So
I can't stress enough the importance of the buddy Urza comes along with. That construct is extremely useful, both in allowing you to pursue a entirely new combo. Naturally, you need another body to polymorph if you want to do that. But even more importantly, it allows you to do something under stacks if it's not going perfectly. Naturally, if you've static orbed everybody out of the game and they can't do anything, that's fine. But if throughout that your Urza gets killed or what have you, it's a shame, but you still have a 7/7 that you can beat people up with. And it provides a real impetus to try and force people to go for a win before they're ready to do so. If you have, as you do now, many decks which use their life total aggressively as a resource, either with Peer into the Abyss, Ad Nauseam, what have you, even a Sylvan Library, and you just take 5 points of their life away every turn, they're obliged to try and win sooner before they're prepared. And as such, it'll give you an opportunity to stop them before they're able to get all of their pieces in place, as well as it'll give you an opportunity because as they're trying to win more quickly, they'll have to tap down lower. So the construct being just a beefy boy is huge. Also, it means that Urza recoups his mana. So that 4 CMC you see in the top of the corner is actually a lie. Urza is 3 mana because he recoups immediately, as well as then turning a bunch of other lower value cards suddenly into Moxen. So he can actually ritual you. If you had an Urza out in the early game, it got removed, and you happen to dump him later, you'll often see that you have more mana after he's resolved than before, which is bizarre.
Yeah, the fact that Urza is functionally ramp, and that this deck, one of the other bullets we have here is utility outside of combo, and we discussed earlier that Mono Blue really struggles to ramp, and that ramp is good. Shocker. Urza ramps, right? And having ramp and an infinite outlet in the command zone is amazing. There's just no way that any of the other Mono Blue commanders can step up to that. And I mean that just because ramping is that good. I mean, look at all of the strategies in this format. All of them are trying to cast 5+ mana spells and protection and things, and ramp is the best thing to do. It just is. There's nothing winning without this ridiculous dockside making tons of mana, which lets you sidestep hate and do all these other things. So ramp is good. Urza lets you ramp, and he's an outlet. It's just clearly a step forward from where Teferi is, in my opinion.
The I think there's you to shore up the weakness that the color combination, that is to say, that the single color has. So you shore up your biggest weakness and then also play into your strengths, as well as having it opens up combos which other mono blue decks which don't.
There's also kind of a point here on card quality where you can be more proactive in playing, your stacks pieces while also realizing your plan to ramp because of course, of Urza. Cool. So we've seen, I think there's always a rush in the CDH community to get kind of the first list out, and I love that about the community, absolutely. So in the early days, we're talking about I mean, you guys know better than me, but there was the UPS list, which is Sick, Shaper, Siggy, Lurker, to be correct.
That's right.
And of course, since then it's evolved into the Discord and that. Do you guys want to maybe talk about that?
So I wasn't around when the first list was written. I joined EDH a little bit later than that, but it was the first list I've seen on the CDH database and on Tapped Out as well. So naturally, I went from there and made my own list out of it, which is still pretty similar to the original list. So, or at least to the list that you can see on the Tapped Out link right now. Yeah, and that's also the reason why I'm personally still not on the polymorph train. Yeah, in my opinion, it's a really strong list, but maybe that's because it plays a lot of staples, and Urza is such a incredibly good commander to have.
I had a wonderful time with, as you put it, Matt, the mad dash when it was first spoiled. During spoiler season, Urza was printed. Naturally, a number of my friends who knew I played messaged me to show me it, and I left from work to go pick up the cards for it, and by the time I got home, there was already a deck list for it. So that was pretty amazing. At that time, the list was much closer to what Chain Veil Teferi was, relying on some of the best mono blue cards. The adaptations I made from that, so credit for all of those deck makers for this inspiration, but the direction I took it at was to play much more into synergies with Urza. By my view, Mock Sapphire is a pretty good card, so I just put in as many versions of 0 CMC artifacts as I could, and probably went a little overboard. I then had the great fortune to actually play with Sick, Reed, as well as Shaper and Lurker at Grand Prix Montreal, and in fact got to play some mirror matches then. And at the time, I was on some very different build than I am now. Of course, it was creature based, as well as the deck was more reliant on Future Sight combos with Top and whatnot. Where at the time I played Mystic Forge instead, which didn't work out how I wanted it.
That's a take.
But anyways, worth a try. But in playing with them in the discussions, I mentioned how I thought it was wise to basically just not go all in on Urza, because that's a little too much, but play as much into just him being good as possible, with specific emphasis on putting Mock Sapphire that can be cantripped away when you don't have him. And so that's why my list will play a higher density of those, as well as synergistic cards with those like Paradoxical Outcome. But it's adapted a lot. And then, of course, Polymorph happened and lots of things changed.
Yeah, what's that about? What's this creatureless deck list that we're hinting at?
Something bouncy boy. So the creatureless list is is what we call the polymorph, the polytyrant build of Urza, and essentially the way it works is you don't run any creature other than Tidespell Tyrant, and you run the polymorph effects, which reveal cards from the top of your library until they reveal a creature, and then you put that creature into play. So it plays both Proteus Staff and polymorph, and when resolving either one of those abilities, you get Tidespell Tyrant, and then you trivially kind of go infinite with mana positive rocks. So that could be, 0 cost mana or 0 cost artifacts that you can play and then trigger Tidespell Tyrant and then bounce another 0 cost artifact to your hand after tapping it for mana with Urza, producing infinite mana, of course, and then you can play your entire deck with Urza's ability. The reason that this list, in my humble opinion, is the only way to play this deck, cough, cough, is...
Humble opinion.
My humble opinion is that if you don't play this, you are wrong. But the real advantage to this is that you kind of turn Polymorph into a, air quotes again, 1-card win condition, in that the only things required to go off are your construct and incidentals, like cards that you would incidentally have anyway. And I always say this about this combo, but like, if you can't meet the requirements of being able to go off infinitely with Tidespell Tyrant, you're probably losing the game anyway. Like, if you're not in a position to have mana positive rocks or 0 cost artifacts to go off after you have a Tidespell Tyrant in play, it's kind of like you were already in a real bad spot.
They're also, those rocks are used for its other combos. So if you're developing things like Grim Monolith for use as the power artifact combo, or developing artifacts for Isochron Scepter lines, it doesn't telegraph that you might be going for a polymorph line, because also it feeds into the other ones. The requirements are no different from the other lines, which obfuscates what your plan might be. It's disguised well, is what I'll say.
Which is definitely kind of a...
It's true. It turns your... It also happens... I mean, people say 1-card win condition about everything. At this point, I think Llanowar Elves is a 1-card win condition. But Polymorph is as close
because
to a
you can
1-card win
neoform
condition
it
as you can get.
Training grounds.
Because you really do just need the Polymorph and then a bunch of random stuff, and it can be anything. They also don't have to be all mana positive rocks, which is nice. A Mana Vault and Sapphire Medallion, one being -1, the other being +2, means that you can combo with a lot of stuff. It also allows you to play through Hate, which would normally be crippling to a mono blue deck. Naturally, it doesn't require the use of any artifact activated abilities because you're tapping them to Urza if you have 0 drops. as well as you can actually just use some of the bounce triggers of the Tyrant to bounce whatever hate piece might be stopping you.
Yeah.
The real thing, the
that
real thing
that
is
last
low
point,
opportunity cost.
I do want to say that on that last point about stopping hate pieces or working around hate pieces, it is really hard to understate how powerful that is. The fact that, once you produce infinite mana or with one spell, your win condition also answers every relevant kind of hate in the format is kind of like very hard for me to step away from. I mean, the number of games that I've won where I can use a bounce trigger, because it's on cast, by the way, it's right. So like any spell you cast triggers this. So like Torpor Orb doesn't stop it. Like Null Rod doesn't stop it. Curse Totem doesn't stop it. There's no real way to combat this with permanence that doesn't just get obviated by the fact that you can bounce it.
There's two important points I just want to touch on before I've said my piece for the differences. And the first is that these decks aren't actually that different. It's a low opportunity cost to run creatureless because UPS only has 4 creatures in the first place, so it's not like you're losing a ton of card quality. You are losing some very strong effects, especially things like Gilded Drake and Spellseeker, but you gaining the other win condition is helpful. And then the last one is there's actually a variety of polymorph effects, and Sinivi and I only do play 2 in Polymorph and Proteus Staff, but if you chose to take this much more in a polymorph line, you have the options of Reweave, which is a 6 mana instant, and Randomly Arcane. You can mass polymorph, which is again a sorcery in 6 mana. Synthetic Destiny is a 6 mana instant, and then you have the 2 strangest ones, which are creature polymorph effects in Jalira, which is basically just Proteus Staff but on a creature, so it's worse.
Right.
And the very strange Riptide Shapeshifter. I could see running maybe Reweave, and I have seen people do Mass Polymorph and Synthetic Destiny, although in those cases, because it kills both of your creatures, they often are not getting Tidespout Tyrant and instead get Thassa's Oracle and Leveler,
they're getting...
which is...
it's a God. I just... Why? I hope when we get to the single card discussion, I can't wait to shit on Thassa's Oracle being played in this deck. I look forward to that. Just saying.
Please do that.
One point I want to bring up just before we move on specifically with Tidespout is the one kind of hate that it doesn't stop are permanents that limit the amount of spells you can cast in a turn. Of course, if you cast your Polymorph, you're not going to be able to cast a spell to bounce that. So that is certainly a limitation.
You Proteus Staff for those conditions. So
yeah, if you do have Proteus Staff, then you are doing.
But to be fair, then you're
well.
casting Proteus Staff and passing turn. I mean, this feeds.
Then you're also not responding to removal, right?
So good, but it's yeah.
Those rule of law type effects are also very bad for the other 2 combos we play. Yeah. So you can't go off with Ice Crown Scepter, and you're also it's very hard to go off with Grim Monolith Power Artifact, because the second you cast Power Artifact, you've already cast that one spell, and then you can't go for a bounce effect, which hurts, so you will have to wait a turn, and then hope nobody destroys your combo, which will...
Yeah.
Well, the nice thing about that, though, is that with Power Artifact, and this is why I still like running Power Artifact, in a rule of law situation, you can pass the turn and then activate Urza, ad nauseum.
I don't
sort of intended
that plan. But
I didn't say it was a good plan. I just said, if you have to play into a rule of law, you can get away with this because you don't have to cast every one that you flip. You can just keep flipping and then pick what you want to cast.
I suppose we didn't discuss, because I think most of the listeners of this podcast are at least familiar with CDH in the deck, is that Urza's activated ability is quite poor. It does not get around timing restrictions, so you have to cast the spells as they normally would be cast. It does allow you to play a land, which is nice. And the other big thing is if you can't cast that spell, or you choose not to, it just remains exiled. So I have some concerns about passing the turn, exiling a large portion of my library. As yet, I don't believe that either of our Verta have the ability to win at instant speed.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think that, like going on that topic of Urza's activated ability, I don't think you should use it anytime if you're not going off. Like, I use it sometimes if I have nothing better to do. And I have enough mana open to at least pretend that I have interaction. So that's the only time I use his third ability, and it really goes poorly most of the time.
If they had templated it like Thrasios' ability, where the lands went into play and you just drew, that would be much better, but they didn't.
That would be pretty nice.
Everyone also has a story of when they've activated Urza's ability when someone's win condition is on the stack and they just mised into like a Force of Will or something, and that's all nice, but don't try and do that. Also, if you're intending to activate Urza's ability, a common mistake that I see is for people to have played their land first, which means that if they hit a land, which is a third of the deck, then they can't do anything with it, as well as to wait to do it on people's end step, because then a large portion of your deck being only sorcery speed means that that's also wasted. So if you really have nothing and you're not trying to gain value from a bluff, just spin it main phase, see what happens. But last resort, that's a last resort.
Yeah, that's also a common mistake too with the...
Yeah, a lot of people try to play Urza's activated ability as if he was Thrasios, which he's definitely not.
So if you're coming from other decks and trying to use his ability as you would maybe some specific 2CMC Simic partner card, just it doesn't work at all like that, and you have to rethink how that works. Basically, only activate it if you have no other option or you're winning the game.
Yeah, 1.2 in regards to like saving your land drop, if you are on the Future Sight version, that is also very good advice. Definitely get your Future Sight down before playing your land. And I guess the last point in this section is, how do you guys find Urza is placed in the metagame? I guess this is history, so I guess over time.
So, of course, Senevi, you go first, please, if you want.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a sore spot, because the deck definitely suffered from the removal of Paradox Engine. I think this is a big deal. I mean, I was, to be honest, when this deck was first brewed, I was too stubborn to stop playing Arkham to start playing Urza. And I was still, kind of trying to play Arkham as a tier 1 mono blue deck. And I think Pension in both of those decks was kind of a centerpiece strategy. And I think it just added a dimension to the deck that made it like really tier 0. And I think that without Pension, you lose the ability to like oopsie into a win. You have to be much more deliberate and kind of constructed now and intentional now about assembling your win conditions than you did when Pension was in the deck, because you could just oopsie onto a tutor for into play an ETB tutor like Transmute Artifact or something and find yourself able to win the game on the back of that, and you can't do that anymore.
Right.
Yeah, I think I agree with that, and I think that Urza has also suffered in the current meta a bit. So everybody has probably listened to the last podcast you guys uploaded, which talks about his current positioning in the CDH meta. And although I don't think that the numbers are that relevant and also not that accurate, I've experienced it. I've experienced the how you say it. The win rate went down. My personal win rate has also went down. Not only the win rates we talk about on the Discord server, but also my personal win rates have went down a bit. Not as much as in the data, but yeah, you can feel it, definitely.
I've always enjoyed playing Urza. I wouldn't agree that it was ever part of the Tier 0 club. I believe Modern Horizons came out in 2019, and by that time, partner decks had been highly optimized to the point that that's a tough comparison to make. But it was and will likely remain tier 1 for whatever that's worth for some time, just based on raw power level. Losing Paradox Engine sucked. Weird note is that I observed and experienced a higher win percentage when Flash was legal. And it was hard for me to figure out why that was, but my theory is that because there's an existing boogeyman in the format, which means that you have to hold up your interaction and have it be hyper premium at all times, people were less likely to fire off removal or use counterspells on your powerful but not game-winning threats. Whereas now, if someone's passing the turn, they have a red mana open, they're like, well, I might as well use this Pyroblast and set you back a couple turns, which hurts. To make specific mention to the metagame project, I think we've seen pretty low win percentages. I'm not sure how it's changed over time. I believe it's gone down. Some of that is hard to tease out why it might be. I'm happy enough to enjoy a slightly high. I'm happy enough to enjoy a higher than the 15% win rate, which it suggests. And I wonder how much of that is through changing pod conditions. But Urza does well in a mixed pod. If everyone's control, you're gonna have a miserable time, and if everyone is fast combo, it's not gonna work. But if you have a little bit of everything, you have a diverse metagame, it fits in quite nicely because you're not faster than the fastest decks, you're not grindier than the most controlling decks, but you're trickier than anybody. And you can just use that trickiness to eke out wins where people might not be able to expect them.
I really feel like it's worth talking also about this dynamic that we see a lot. That people come to the Discord with their lists, and I know I said we would get to this in the single card selection, but I have a raging clue that the players that are playing Thassa's Oracle and things like Training Grounds in this deck are probably losing a lot of games. But beyond that, I think that there are two things, very specifically two things that about the current metagame that make Urza, put in an awkward spot. The first is that you are the best deck at the table, bar none, every single game at feeding two cards, which are omnipresent and honestly just like backbreaking for this deck. And that is Dockside Extortionist and a card that, if you know me on the Discord, you know that I have very strong feelings about, and that's Carpet of Flowers. Yeah. These two cards sidestep everything that this deck can do to disrupt and deny resources, which is something it's exceptional at. And the fact that they exist in basically every single tier 1, tier 0 deck it's backbreaking, honestly. Like, the number of times that I have spent 2 or 3 turns to set up kind of a soft lock and expended a bunch of interaction to prevent people from winning, and someone just windmill slams a Carpet of Flowers and starts generating like 4 or 5 mana around my like orb effects and things, or my back to basics, is just like, it is maddening. Oh my god, it's maddening.
It's fair to say that the printing of Dranith Magistrate didn't do Commander Reliant decks any favors either.
That's fair. That's totally fair.
100%.
Yeah, but I think that the Dranith Magistrate is strong, but he hurts everybody a bit. He hurts us more, maybe, in most parts, but he's generally bad for everybody, whereas Dockside Extortionist and Carpet of Flowers gets incredibly better with us in the pot.
Yeah, we literally we go out of our way to supercharge both of those cards, right? Like, and that feels really, really bad.
It goes back to the point too where, like, if you do want to deal with a Dranith, it is a 1 for 2, and that's not at all where you want to be, especially in a multiplayer game. Yeah, so I guess before we move on, any other notes on history? Cool. So we got deck construction, and this is definitely going to be one of the meatier topics, and we've gone ahead and created categories that can kind of provide some succinctness to this. So to start things off, what are generally the win conditions that you find in Urza decks?
Okay, so the win conditions that are played in 99% of Urza decks are Isoref combo, because we can generate enough mana to just go off, so we don't have to actually worry about the rock aspect that often. Then the second combo we have is Grim Monolith plus Power Artifact, which is also a pretty good combo. Also a combo I like a little more than the Isoref combo. It is harder to tutor for because we can't get a power artifact that easily. But I like the fact that we can get out a Grim Monolith, lay low, wait till we are able to tutor for or draw into a power artifact, and then go off with interaction in hand. A lot of times most of times I don't see anybody targeting my Grim Monolith because everybody is either waiting for me to play Icyclonic Scepter or are focused on other more stronger artifacts that are in play. And then lastly, we have the Polytyrant combo, which I'm definitely not an expert on, so I will let Keegan and Cinevi do the talking on that.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this earlier, right? Like the Bouncy Boy combo just means you polymorph your construct into Tidespout Tyrant, and then you proceed to do Bouncy Boy things and make lots of mana infinitely. So it's another way to make infinite mana and utilize Urza as an outlet is the TLDR.
I think there's some combos which we'll see players come in with regularly, which bear some lip service, and we're not going to, I think, spend a lot of time on budget alternatives, just due to the nature of this podcast. But there are options which include Future Sight, Top, and Ethereum Sculptor. Naturally, not playable in Polytyrant, except for there are alternatives to Sculptor, so you can play something like Cloud Key, and this allows you to draw your entire deck. This is somewhat limited because it's 3 cards and Future Sight is untutorable. It's okay because each of them is pretty good on their own. Top is something that you'll want to play anyways. Future Sight is an alright piece of card advantage on its own, so that's nice.
I think we feel differently about Future Sight. I think this card is hot trash, honestly.
I'm not very big on it. I think I mentioned before that I did play this combo at a time, and I could see playing this in a version that did not include Polytyrant, I suppose, just as another combo, even though I'm not a big fan. Mystic Forge is easier to search, but it's so much worse on its own. I think
this is a great budget option, but I also kind of think that Urza as a deck is not a great budget deck.
No,
necessarily.
Crypt.
Yeah.
There's also Rings Basalt, which is a very popular option. In fact, most people who have not had exposure to the CDH community but want to build Urza will include this. But the problem is Basalt Monolith is quite poor on its own. It's not great. And Rings is very bad on its own. And the mana required to assemble it is not ideal. There is some help in that Basalt is redundancy with Grim Monolith for power artifact lines, which is something, but not a lot. And the last sort of redundant piece I'd mention would be I've seen people use the newly printed Lithoform engine in addition to Icyclonic Scepter because it has additional utility, and also in UPS allows you to double up on Spellseeker triggers to look for things. So it does open up other options, but it's a lot of mana, which I'm not experienced enough in playing it to lambast it entirely. It's possible that there is some game there, but it strikes me as a little bit clunky.
Yeah, I'm also not on it, and I'm not really considering it. Like it looks interesting, but I also think that it's too expensive and not good enough on its own to include it. So I'll leave the testing to someone else.
That's fair.
Yeah, specifically like in regards to redundancy, like the deck is chock full of artifact tutors. It doesn't run all the artifact tutors, so having kind of redundant, like placeholder tutor cards that kind of act as Scepter, I think is already good enough. I'm sure there's a metagame where there's like rest in pieces and like exile effects where you really do kind of want the redundancy, but it's just we're not really there.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like you could make a metagame to justify most.
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
100%.
Sensei's Top Sculptor combo. I played it for quite a while, actually. But I've also come to the conclusion that Future Sight is just bad on its own. Like, I really dislike the card. It gives away information, which is something we do not want to do.
Yeah.
And the fact that you can cast spell after spell after spell, is very rare, so it really rarely happens. Most of the time you will get blocked at some point and can't continue, and then your opponents will know what you will draw on your next turn. The only reason I played it for so long is because I really liked the Ethereum Sculptor and the combo. Yeah, so Ethereum Sculptor gets much better with the combo than without it. And I liked Ethereum Sculptor for the fact that if you played a Time Spiral and have a Ethereum Sculptor in hand, that makes for really explosive turns, and most of the time those won me the game. But yeah.
There is some redundancy. You can play a Psi instead of Ethereum Sculptor because it produces mana by its triggers, but I think that Psi was something that was included in earlier deck lists, but has since been pretty much dropped by everyone as being too cute. So while that is a viable combo, the Psi is too poor on its own, and it's important that your combo be as compact as possible and that its various elements have some utility outside of winning the game.
And that's also true for Ethereum Sculptor. So it's very good with the combo, although the combo is not that good. But it's pretty bad outside of the combo because you don't actually have that many artifacts that would make it worth it.
Yeah.
So we play a lot of very cheap artifacts, and then we also have a lot of ramps, so we don't really need that cost reduction effect that much.
Yeah. One point on Future Sight too is there kind of already is like a Future Sight deck beside Urza, and that's Elsha, and we've seen for sure that even though Elsha kind of fixes like the giving away information problem, it also has fallen out of favor because compared to the other win conditions, it doesn't really provide any improvements like ISO Rev or Polytyrant really do. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And I really also, this is a point we're probably going to come back to when we talk about other cards, but one cannot simply give away information playing mono blue. That is just not a thing. Like there are cards that even like we talk about cutting, and we kind of have turned into memes on the Discord server, including Factor Fiction, because they give away information, and that's really painful in this deck because like you do have to lean in a little bit to playing Boogeyman. And I guess we're going to get to piloting device later, so we can talk about it there. But giving away information is incorrect, and that card just lets your opponents have all the information.
In a particular event of of error, I put a telepathy in my Teferi deck, and I cut it immediately the first time I was able to play it because I'm like,
oh god,
or not telepathy. There's like I was not happy with the result.
Just don't play telepathy because your games all become 6 hours, because you'd think with perfect information everyone would play more quickly, but it's just information overload.
Yeah, totally. So the next category we have here is ramp, and we did talk about how Urza like really fixes the ramp aspect of mono blue. So let's talk about that.
No, go ahead.
So I think the thing I like the most actually is that you can play all those very cheap artifacts that are like one mana, but replace the cost, the mana you spend on them. So you can pretty much spam the board with a lot of cheap, very nice artifacts like Ether Spellbomb or Witching Well, and then have an ETB effect or something, and then use them for mana later, which is a very interesting idea, especially for Ether Spellbomb. I like that card a lot, because you can cast it, leave it there, not use it for a card draw, and then the second you need it, you can tap itself for mana, sacrifice it, and bounce Urza to protect him, or bounce a creature you need to get rid of to combo off, which is quite nice. Yeah.
This is the part of the deck which is most unique from other blue decks and most other decks in general. There's very little to no 2 mana ramp here, with the single exception, I believe, of Sapphire Medallion, and that's because you are granted the opportunity to play 0 mana ramp, which is just obviously so much better. This is especially important if you're playing a polymorph version, because these 0 CMC artifacts are needed to pursue its combo. But it does make you just so fast to be able to put those in. And it also means that you have a little bit of flexibility as to what you could put in. So basically any zero CMC artifact has the potential to be played in Urza and should be examined because at its upside, it's exceptional. But you do have a lot to choose from, and so you have the opportunity to be a little bit discerning. Note, obviously, that because it's Urza's ability that's tapping it and not the artifact, gets around Null Rod, which is nice, but not something like Linvala.
Or Curse Totem,
And finally, I have put a particular premium on 0 CMC artifacts and 1 CMC artifacts, which have utility outside of being mana rocks. So things like, of course, Aether Spellbomb, Witching Well, Astrolabe, and any of the baubles in Mishra's Urza's Lodestone, which can cantrip away. All of those do something in their failure state, and then just happen to also be Mock Sapphire when your deck's doing its thing.
Well, that's interesting you say that, because I noticed that you're not playing Tormod's Crypt, and that card kind of feels like a gimme to me. And in terms of exactly what you were just talking about, 0 CMC rocks that for Bouncy Boy feed the combo, but also have the upside of Oopsie shutting down Breach. Like, that card is super fire. I would have a very hard time cutting that card. And
I think you play a couple 0 CMC rocks that I don't. I know at the very least you play Tormod's Crypt and Welding Jar, which are both very good, protecting your stuff as well as exiling graveyards. I found to be powerful. I prioritized the artifacts which were card selection and card draw over interactability when they were ramp. But in a world now that we're seeing more and more graveyard-based decks like Breach, where Tormod's Crypt is much better, I think that's valuable.
Just to talk, maybe to mention your meta, like, do you actually play against a lot of graveyard-centric decks, or?
So for me, it's my meta consists of play EDH competitive rooms. I do not play at an LGS simply because I do not have the time to do it. So I see Breach a whole lot, like pretty much in every pot. Same for Dockside, same for Ad Nauseam. So I don't think that I have played in any pot that didn't have any one of those.
Most of my play group is so of course I play on the CDH Nexus Open, and in those cases I'll see a lot more Breach decks, Turbo Nas decks, but by far the majority of my games are played with people I know personally, and of those I believe there's one Curious Control. Of course it doesn't play Curiosity, but you get the idea. I think 3 medium green decks, which is cancer to this deck, so that's a particularly troublesome one. Gitrog represents the only graveyard deck, but unfortunately Tormod's Crypt is insufficient to stop that combo, so not super useful there. As well as then a variety of 3-color valuable decks, such as Kaikar. I don't think I've seen an Elsha, and the Wizard Commander with Eminence, whatever its name might be.
Anala, yeah.
Anala, yes. So that's also been popular. And then a number of 2-color decks which are highly proactive on their own game plan, such as Edric Virals and Tygum are popular ones. I want to talk about my meta, but I also want to make 2 points about the ramp section of deck construction here. So
sure,
I'll talk about meta first, and then I'll come back to the ramp thing. I also play on PlayDH. My experience there, honestly, has been more that it's like there's a lot of stacks decks on that server. I play against a lot of stacks on that server, and I play a lot of stacks myself, so that's kind of interesting. But otherwise, I have a pretty good group of friends that either I played with through college or who play in Colorado here, where I live, with me in person. And that meta is much more graveyard-centric, to be fair. I mean, there's a Tadiova player. All of their combos revolve around the graveyard in many cases, or they just get tons of value out of, like, Ramanap. Lots of people on Breach, multiple Kess decks. There's a couple people on Hermit Druid, so there's a lot of stuff that revolves around the graveyard. So that is like it's not an option to cut that for me.
Yeah. So
Yeah, and we don't. So that's a downside actually of playing Bouncy Boy is that we don't get to play Grafdigger's Cage because we have to get Tidespout Tyrant to play from our library. So yeah,
that's a great point. I know it. Yeah, I know this is kind of a departure from the notes. I think it's important that we maybe you should have done this earlier, but like discussing our metagames certainly is how we inform our personal deck construction choices. So let's move back to ramp unless anyone else has
I suppose I would be remiss if I didn't account for the many games I played against Lyndon's Blood Pod deck. So that also is the representative other stacks deck.
Raspberry Jam.
Oh, I don't know what he calls it. I think
it might just be
Blood Pod, but it then has more stacks pieces than usual and no Blood Moon or Birthing Pod. So maybe a bit of a departure from the nomenclature.
So on the subject of ramp, I think that there are two things that I want to say here before we move on. The first is that there are two kinds of ramp. Ramp, which facilitates you casting Urza faster, and ramp, which helps after Urza has been cast. This is an important distinction because you have to have a good balance of both things. And cards which, so that it makes certain cards awkward, right? So it makes Mople, Mox Opal in some circumstances very awkward because it doesn't accelerate you towards Urza. And that can be problematic because you can end up in a circumstance where you actually just don't have the opportunity to cast Urza, and you have a bunch of other rocks or cards that would do things if you could cast Urza, but you can't. So you kind of have to pay attention to that. And then the other thing that is worth noting is that it is amazing how much better certain cards get when they tap for 1 mana as well. So the bar kind of like goes way down when everything taps for mana. I'm thinking of specifically things like Top. Top is good, but we're not really playing anything that it combos with. It just is much better when it itself can tap for mana and be card selection. And then also stuff like Pithing Needle, where it's a kind of a narrow answer, but because you're trying to drag the game out and there are lots of targets, the fact that it taps for 1 mana is just good enough. So you get to kind of play some things like that in some of the slots as well.
Yeah. And then what I would like to add is that I see a lot of people, especially newer people that are new to the deck, that add cards like Arcane Signet or Threatened Dynamo or even Gilded Lotus. Those cards really do not have a spot in Urza. Because we have so much better ramp. We have ramp with utility. We can make everything a Mox Safari. So you also always have to keep that in mind when constructing this deck. Even in budget decks, you can just jam an interactive 0 or 1 mana artifact that has an ATB effect or something that would definitely still be better than all those high CMC rocks.
One important thing I think to mention is that our rocks being so cheap means that this deck has a play pattern of vomiting its hand onto the table fairly quickly. And as Sinivi mentioned, some of those rocks will not be able to tap for mana until Urza resolves. Naturally, once he does, you have a ton. But because of this high density of low CMC quote-unquote rocks, it makes any wheel effects absolutely phenomenal because Vomit Hand, Reload to 7, and Repeat is just an extremely effective game plan because it's difficult for your opponents to develop their own game plan when their hand is getting wheeled away, as well as you can just churn through large portions of your library and then find yourself with a lot of mana, no cards, and then replenish your cards and have everything you need.
Yeah, well, and then the last thing I would like to say is that you should definitely not play Mox Amber.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
See that way too often. Yeah.
I think it's somewhat important. So many people have suggested this that I feel like the specific reason is because they say, well, you have Urza, he's legendary, so it taps for blue. But then you need to think to yourself, well, because you have Urza, it taps for blue anyways. So its failure state is it does nothing, and its best case scenario is it's a worse Darksteel talisman or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, totally true.
I actually want to riff on.
Oh, pardon. Yeah, go ahead.
I want to riff on what Keegan mentioned about vomiting your hand into play, because I think that maybe to skip some of these sections and go to like card advantage and bombs. this aspect of the deck is why playing card advantage engines, wheels, and bombs are so good, because you have this, this critical mass of ramp, and the deck does produce a lot of mana. When you get into a state where you've puked your hand into play and you have like 1 or 2 cards left and they're both interaction, that's not actually a very good position for this deck to be in. Like, you don't really want to be in that spot, because it means that you have to like pray that you top deck well, and in my experience this deck does not top deck particularly well. So you create these scenarios where what you actually want is some kind of payoff. It's almost like playing Nas in some ways, where you have a lot of you have a density of hands that do a couple of things. One of them is vomit a whole bunch of rocks into play and then wheel or play like a time spiral kind of effect. And it just puts additional emphasis on playing cards like that. And so, those like 5-6 mana draw cards spells, or things like Consecrated Sphinx if you're playing UPS, just get much more attractive because they let you do something that is like super abusive very early, and they serve as a payoff, which is something that we're kind of short on in this deck.
We really have that issue of being really fast turn 1, turn 2, get Urza out, and then have nothing to do with the mana we have.
Yeah, and I did talk about kind of the wheel point again. Like, we are in a meta of Underworld Breach, and like there are incidental wheels, and that. But that being said, like, it's not certainly something to rely on, like dumping your hand out. But is absolutely something that you can expect out of your other decks. So I guess what that means is, like, personally, how I would play is to get your cards into play as soon as you can, because it might be inevitable that your opponent casts a wheel.
This might bleed into play pattern suggestions, but there are few situations when you'd want to hold on to your 0 CMC spells. Like, if you're looking at an Everflowing Chalice and you're never going to multi-kick it, you're just going to play it for 0, it's probably better to just do that earlier rather than later. Because, again, you get wheeled away, who knows, maybe a Rule of Law or Trinisphere happens, and then it's much worse, and you'll be kicking yourself. Even
I totally
something as
agree.
simple as Rhystic Study or Mystic Remora, like anything like that, means basically play your cards when you can. The one exception to this is if you're aiming to do a polymorph win, it's necessary that you retain a cheap spell to start your loop by casting it.
Yeah. The thing with Everflowing Chalice also is that the only time it's worth it to multi-kick it if you pay 4. At least. So I don't think that I've multi-kicked it a lot of times. I just play it out, use it as a rock when Urza's out.
I tend
which
to
is
feel
particularly
the same.
not going to be happening before you cast Urza.
The upside of Everflowing Chalice is that you can cast it before Urza with 2 mana, and it ramps. Like, that's a thing that I don't think it's right to not be on this card, because unlike many of your other 0-cost artifacts, it actually does accelerate you towards Urza in a pinch where you needed to, and that is really critical because it just increases the density of hands that you get that allow you to play your general. And not being able to do that and being stuck with a different 0-cost artifact that does not produce mana in your hand is really not a good position to be in.
Yeah, you want to be developing as fast as the other decks in the pod, and if you're up against Thrasios where it's a consistent turn 2 play, then you do want to like very much at least get Urza in the turn 3. But of course, if you can go earlier, that's phenomenal. So yeah, let's go into the next section, which is disruption, and this is like a big part of how Urza works, I think, in my opinion. So yeah, let's talk about that.
Sure, yeah. Well, the best things we have with Urza are the artifacts that we can shut off by tapping them, of course. That being Winter Orb and Static Orb. They're incredibly strong with Urza. And then we also have Back to Basics, which works really fine with this deck because we play mostly islands, and so we're not affected by it that much, or at least as much as 3-color or 4-color commanders are, and especially decks that have a tainted mana base. So we use these cards to deny mana as good as possible and break parity on them. And that's also why cards like Carpet of Flowers really hurts us, because it plays around that effect.
Oh my god, I can't even think about Carpet of Flowers without getting upset. It's just, it's what Eisenhurst is saying is exactly right, right? Like, we have the ability to tutor into play the orb effects, which turn off everyone else's ability to generate mana and do not do anything to us at all, because we can tap them at will to cast spells or to turn them off and untap on our turns. And the fact that a 1 green mana enchantment simply sidesteps all of this, because you're certainly not going to stop playing islands because you can't play anything else, is maddening.
There aren't as high of a density in stacks pieces within Urza as there might be in other dedicated stack decks, especially those which use creature-based stack decks. But the ones that we do have are phenomenal. So naturally, Static Orb, Winter Orb, and Trinisphere being the premier options. I want to quickly say how they can do different things. Winter Orb and Static Orb are not as exceptional in the early game because naturally there are fewer permanents to untap, but there's something that's really good to tutor for in the mid game to stymie development. If you have the opportunity to develop an early Trinisphere, it is absolutely phenomenal. There's a whole dynamic of when you should tap it and when you should leave it tapped, which is too complicated for this short segment. But in general, you, with Urza out, play very well with behind a Trinisphere because you can have a ton of mana and just develop your cards. Also, you tend to have fewer cards in hand, so you're not trying to storm off or something underneath it. So people, I think, should be searching for Trinisphere and casting it if they're trying to develop an early stacks piece. I think that it's often right for that to be Trinisphere. And two other cards which are often discussed, but I don't believe included in any of our decks, are Tangle Wire and Storage Matrix. Storage Matrix is basically a worse Winter Orb / Static Orb, and it's better to have two very good versions of that effect than have the third one basically be you'd never tutor for it unless the other two got destroyed. So that's a niche enough scenario you don't want to do it. And then Tangle Wire is worse in the mid game than Winter Orb and Static Orb, and then worse in the early game than Trinisphere. So it also suffers a bit from that. What I'm trying to get across here is that while hate and stacks mana attack are a central part of our strategy, we don't play a ton of different versions of it. We just have the cream of the crop, which we'll actively search for regularly. I think it's also fair to say that Tabernacle falls into that as one of the premier stacks pieces, but that's one that's harder to play around. You can't really search for it in the same way as you can artifacts, so if you happen to have a Tabernacle in your hand, great, it's probably going to be very good, but just take that as it comes.
I think I'm also on a piece of disruption that neither of the others are on, and that's Torpor Orb. I play Torpor Orb because it just shits on Dockside. I think this really matters a lot more than I think it matters a lot more than people give it credit for. And the primary argument for not playing this card is that, but it shuts off my construct. And I don't think that's like super compelling when the other thing that it's doing is preventing everyone else at the table from winning the game. Like, fine, I don't get a construct, but you can't win is very good.
Yeah. If I was on Polymorph, or if I ever make this change to Polymorph, I will probably include Torpor Orb because of Dockside and Thassa's Oracle.
The other thing is, like, you don't need the construct to win with Tidespot Tyrant, because you can, depending on what rocks you have in your availability of mana, if you have enough blue mana, you can just polymorph Urza, find Tidespot Tyrant, go infinite, and then play Urza again after bouncing the Torpor Orb if you need to. And
that's not as easy, because there aren't a ton of cards which allow you to produce blue mana for free. I think
that's fair.
Mox Opal, because the natural other ones like Mox Diamond and Chromox would require you to pitch cards, which obviously doesn't work with Polytyrant. You know what? It's interesting. It's something which I could see developing after an Urza. It stopping Oracle is huge.
Yep.
Stopping Dockside is big.
Yep.
If there is a place to play it, it's definitely in a polymorph version, because the many creatures, the mages, for instance, and Gilded Drake being shut off by that is too hard of a nombo. But if you've had good experience with it, I could see it being viable for sure.
And it really hurts not only Dockside and Thus Oracle. There are so many great ETB effects that it stops that I think it's really worth playing. And
I mean, it stops all the Kiki-based win conditions too. Like this card, honestly, it shuts off like half of the format. So another deck I play a lot of is Heliod, and these effects in that deck I kind of hold in the same regard. Like stopping the most common win conditions in the entire format on any effect in a stacks deck is exceptionally powerful. It is something you absolutely want to lean into.
And then also, if you want to recast Urza, you only need 2 blue mana to do it. So once you go infinite, you probably have the 2 blue mana from your lands if you didn't use your last blue mana to cast Polymorph.
I was going to say that to Keegan as well, is that, you know, most of the time when you get to the point where Torpor Orb has accomplished anything, you're going to have enough land that you probably will be able to recast Urza after going infinite.
It's appealing. It's an appealing option. My reservations mostly relate to it being a stacks piece which hits a prevalent but not the entire part of the format. Naturally, a deck that's trying to win with Oracle can get rid of an artifact. And that's not nothing, but it does mean that they have to tutor for one more card, so it makes their wins less explosive. But I don't feel safe behind a Torpor Orb. I don't think it's a shut off in the same way as some other stacks pieces are. So I don't put it in such a high regard as it just being like, oh, I can play this and then I can do whatever I want and be fine behind it. My reasons for not playing it are less relying off the construct. Naturally, I would like a construct. It's a big part of the game plan, but you're probably trying to develop Urza before you develop your stacks pieces anyways, so that happens to be less relevant. It's 2 mana, narrow hate, which I take some issue with, but I can definitely see it being a powerful tool.
I don't know, man. Calling it narrow feels like diminished to me. I mean, it feels reductive. Like the fact that it Thoracle and Dockside and all of the Kiki combos. I mean, like how many decks are winning games commonly with stuff outside of that?
Don't forget
that you wouldn't be able to interact with.
Let me put it another way. I'm sure it's fantastic in Heliod, but I think that Heliod has many more cards to cut than Urza does.
That's fair. That's fair.
Absolutely.
This is
roasted.
not the time to get on the soapbox about Heliod, but I would if given the opportunity. So know that.
The one card we haven't spoken about yet is what's it called again? Back to Basics, of course. Yeah, Back to Basics. So I think it's a really strong, although we can't tutor for it, because once you have it in play, it pretty much stops all the other decks that have the advantage of being not monocolored and being able to play the best cards from different colors. I've seen a lot of players pretty much not bounce to it because they're salty, but phase out the game mentally because they weren't able to do anything anymore. Even like consultation cast players, and I hold Back to Basics in, like, for me it's also on the top of the stacks pieces, although we can't tutor for it because of how strong the effect is in the current meta and how little it affects us being mono blue.
Back to Basics is absolutely phenomenal. If it were tutorable, it would be easily my favorite stacks piece in this deck. Alas, it is not. But I think that whole archetypes having been built around Blood Moon tells us how good non-basic land hate is. The last stacks piece which comes to my mind now is Codex Shredder, which admittedly is more of a combo piece than a stacks piece, but it does do enough double duty that, you know, I don't play it, but it's a great hard outlet that just happens to have a side hustle of top deck tutor hate.
I really just feel like that card is not as good as people think it is. Like, look, my perspective here is as follows. when you are winning and you're already able to cast your library, Codex Shredder is completely unnecessary. It's totally win more. The recursion that it gives us is expensive and also kind of not really doing what we want to do. Like, at the point that you're trying to recur some kind of stacks piece or something, if it's not Isochron Scepter, you're not in a great place to begin with. Like, that's a really shitty spot to be in overall, and I don't think Codex Shredder really does anything to get you there. And the final point is that people playing into, like, no one's gonna tutor into Codex Shredder unless they're bad. So it is a stacks piece in the sense that you probably will prevent people from playing their top deck tutors. But I just am not convinced that it's actually that good, because a lot of these are instant speed and people will just wait until you tap it and respond.
See, I've actually made the other. It's already late in Germany, so my English isn't that good right now. I've experienced it in another way. So a lot of people actually make the mistake of playing a top deck tutor into Codex Shredder because they don't see the card that often. Which, yeah, you can say they play bad, but it really does put in some work. And then also what I like to do is I like to assess the pot and see which deck is the least graveyard reliant or may have the least recursion effects, and then I like to mill them for one every turn cycle.
This is where we differentiate, because I'm off Codex Shredder for a lot of the reasons Sinivi said, but when I had it, I would mill myself for one to fuel Delve, because I felt that it was better for me to have cards in my graveyard than anybody else.
I'm not gonna lie. I play Codex Shredder to fuel Delve.
It's such a minor upside that I felt it better to have cards in my graveyard, which I could then sacrifice Codex Shredder to get back, or fuel Delve. I'm like, well, I might as well do it. And I think it's better for people to have cards in their graveyard than in their deck, with very limited exceptions. So I know it sends a message. It sends a message to mill someone for one, but I don't often think that that's the right thing to do.
I think it's definitely closer to the fine line of it being stronger as a mock Sapphire than it is as, its text.
Yeah, it is. Except so it's not exactly mock Sapphire.
It certainly becomes tough to finally tune a deck when you do have the base condition of mock Sapphire for sure.
How could I forget about all-time favorite Juntu Stakes? So, as part of the mana attack strategy, a way that people can get around that, as well as Winter Orb, is to use creature-based ramp, elves, and what have you. And Juntu Stakes makes every one of those creatures not be able to untap. I suppose with the exception of something like Fabro Elder. It also happens to be exceptional against Najeela. Not just win the game, but it makes them not be able to pressure people until they're trying to go for their combo. So some of these you can kind of pick a la carte, like what do I see a lot of, and then tech in some of those. The Pithing Needle that I know Sinivi plays, as well as his Tormod's Crypt, would be good against Thrasio-centric decks and graveyard decks, respectively. If you see a lot of those, drop them in. If you don't, maybe pick something else.
Yeah, nice. I think that's really important in general. So with this deck being very adaptive, if you want to use that those terms, you will definitely have to assess your own meta as good as you can, because it's really important to put in the right stacks pieces for your meta. And being playing in a blind meta, which I do, I can only use the most those stacks pieces that interact with most tables, and I can't be too specific when choosing the stacks pieces I add into my list.
It does make sense.
Yeah, 100%. So this next section is interaction, and blue. I think that's a bit of more of like a cut and dry suite of cards, but obviously let's go into it. So the first on interaction, and the mono blue staple is counterspells. So what kind of counterspells are we playing?
Well, the usual free counterspells. We have Force of Will, A lot of people play Force of Negation. I've heard of people cutting it because of the card disadvantage. And we have, of course, Swan Song, Pact of Negation. Narset's Reversal is kind of a counterspell. We have Muddle the Mixture, which we mainly use as a tutor, but it's also a counterspell, which is nice. Of course, Mental Misstep to stop those turn 1 fish or turn 1 Carpet of Flowers. Mana Drain, of course. Let's see, what else do we got? We got Flusterstorm. Although it's a soft counterspell, it has Storm, which is incredible. Fierce Guardianship is a new addition because, yeah, well, our deck is commander-centric and we try to get him out as early as turn 2. So it makes for a free negate, which is nice. I personally play Dispel. We have Delay, which is more often than not a hard counterspell. Of course, Counterspell, and then I think that should be it. And I know that a lot of people play some other counterspells, which I'm not on, because mainly I dislike soft counterspells.
Yeah.
I think it's probably worth it to talk just about that class of counterspell, because a lot of the other ones are sort of like, obviously you would play this, right? Like you're playing mono blue and mono blue plays counterspells and these are the best counterspells, and like, yeah, you jam them, of course you do. But then there's a class, I think, of like soft counter or conditional counter that is where this conversation is material or interesting, and that includes stuff like Spell Pierce and Miscast and even like Mana Leak. I know that I'm on Mana Leak because it hits everything, and this deck really struggles, for example, with permanent removal, like once it's on board, and we're probably going to talk about some of that in the other interaction section, but like, you know, Mana Leak hitting creatures is super, super relevant. I know that a lot of people are kind of hyper fixated on, you know, the fact that we're in this ad nauseam meta and spells really matter and are more keen to play something like Miscast or Spell Pierce, but I like Mana Leak because it hits all of the creatures that help those decks get there, and it can be pointed at Dockside, and you know, you can fight over other random things that you wouldn't expect to be able to, or you wouldn't be able to interact with like a Spell Pierce or a Miscast.
I have fewer counterspells in my list than some others. Naturally, this is because of the metagame which I play in, which includes many more grindy decks and fewer fast combo decks, where the opportunity cost of playing 1-for-1 interaction is a little bit higher. Notably, the one I think is most contentious would be I don't play Force of Negation. Would consider that more if there were more instant speed wins going around. My other big stipulation with Force of Negation is that it can't be profitably used to protect your own combo, which I think is very valuable.
Right.
It's great
right.
against as an interaction against other people. The Exile clause is significant for sure, and I would slot that in if I played against more fast combo decks, absolutely. On the soft counterspells, again, being in a grindy metagame means it's just no possibility to do that. Something like Spell Pierce is dead too fast. I suppose I should make specific reference to Spell Snare. Please don't play Spell Snare. It's too narrow. It can be good, but it can also be not good, and it can be not good very easily.
Yeah, I tested Spell Snare quite extensively, and the biggest issue I see is that it's only better than other spells, counter spells we play, is when it targets a 2 CMC creature, because most of our counter spells don't target creatures, so that makes Spell Snare very narrow. Of course, it targets some of the strongest creatures, being Thassa's Oracle, Dockside Explosionist. Then we also have Bob and other good stuff, but mainly Thassa's and Dockside. And yeah, well, even though it targets those really incredibly good cards, it's just overall too narrow. So it's dead more often than it's useful.
There's also a number of people who play Negate, just factual. I think that's was and remains in the original UPS list, but by the same stroke as I criticize Spell Snare, I would say that Negate has little too narrow for what I'd ask of a 2 CMC counterspell. All of the 2 CMC counterspells I play are with the exception of Muddle the Mixture, unconditional. Will counter basically everything. So it's a huge opportunity cost to just throw away your cards. Well, I shouldn't say throw away. It's a huge opportunity cost to be the one to interact with a 2-mana spell, have to hold it up for a couple turns, and not be able to advance your own game plan. And you can very easily find yourself in a play pattern where you put in too much interaction, you're the one who stops someone comboing off, only to watch the next player in turn order just win, and then you're sad.
It also really goes down to piloting the deck. So a lot of people think that playing mono blue, you have to kind of police the table, which is definitely not what we want to do, especially in multiplayer format, because you will run out of gas quicker than anyone else, and then just what Keegan just said will happen. You will watch the next person win.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then also on negate, since we have Fierce Guardianship, I don't think there's any reason to include negate into your deck.
Yeah. And of course there are, non-counterspell interaction spells. So let's get into that. So what kind of removal do we have that's not primarily aimed at protecting the stack?
The silence is because we don't have any. No, I'm just kidding. We have, this is a card that I think gets omitted from a lot of other decks in this format that I think is impossible to omit here is Cyclonic Rift. It frequently is a tutor target for myself just because it is pretty much the only universal answer we have to a lot of problems or situations. So that card obviously gets in here. I think all of us are playing Chain of Vapor. One CMC bounce is good. I'm also on Winds of Rebuke. Again, I'm playing against a lot of things that Winds kind of interacts well with or shuts down. And unlike Codex Shredder, people don't know you have it when they go to top deck tutor. So you can actually blow a lot of people out with this. And I've done this more times than I can count since adding it back to the deck, and I don't think I'll be taking it out just because the surprise factor really just pantses some people. Really, really like that aspect of the card.
The interaction I have that doesn't use the stack is very similar to the rest of you folks. As a replacement for Winds of Rebuke, I play Reality Shift. Similarly, it messes with top deck tutors. The exile clause is relevant, and it's loopable with Time Twister loops to exile libraries. One aspect I want to highlight besides the bounce is the theft effects are removal, but better. So I play and would recommend anyone playing in a CDH metagame to jump on top of Steal Enchantment. It's enormous, and it's very, very good against things that are good against us. So Carpet of Flowers and Smothering Tithe, Rhystic Study, Mystic Remora, anything of this nature, Necropotence, which allows people to just skyrocket on mana, which is what we're trying to attack, as well as get cards throughout a longer game without having to invest mana in it. Those are things which cripple Urza, and having a 2-mana answer to that just as a bonus happens to give you the advantage of that card. I cannot overstate how valuable this card is in combating those strategies. Otherwise, there's creature theft effects in Legacy's Allure and Vidalcan Shackles. I'm only on Legacy's Allure because it's exceptional at stealing Thrasios, so that makes it worth it pretty much on its face value to me. Vidalcan Shackles, I know, Sinivi, you've had success with that. For me, I found it a little too mana intensive, but pick your poison on what you want to remove. But it's better to spend your resource not to 1-for-1, but to actually recoup that card by taking it back. So theft effects are exceptional for that reason.
Yeah, I'm on honestly, Vidalcan Shackles is something that is in and out of the deck for me. I think in the games that I play blind, this card is a house. this card does so many things to so many people that they do not expect that it is like, I can't come to cutting it in the blind. I mean, I play a lot against a lot of hate bears, and this thing taking stuff like someone else's Draneth or a Grand Abolisher is super good. And yeah, being able to steal people's Thrasios and like take someone's Tymna and then start hitting with Construct and Urza, like there are so many situations where it's just super ultra mega value that I'm like really hot on it. But I totally could see not playing it, especially if you're not playing against a lot of stuff like that. Like if you're in the what people refer to as the Finnish meta, which I think is just like generic Grixis deck. Yeah, it's probably not very good, and it's too mana intensive to be super relevant.
If you weren't on Poly or like Bouncy Boy combo, would you think about not playing it?
Yeah, definitely. I think you don't need it if you have Gilded Drake. Like Gilded Drake is just like so much better.
You obviously, like you have the added advantage of being able to tutor for it. Though, like, I mean, like that kind of play is definitely a questionable tutor, but you do have that option. Obviously, with Gilded Drake, your greatest tutor is Muddle the Mixture, which is also not a card that every Urza deck runs.
I've yet to come across an Urza deck that didn't have a Muddle the Mixture.
Okay, I could just be getting that wrong. Yep.
I would definitely say that not playing Muddle is wrong.
Your both halves of ISO Rev and both halves of Grim Monolith Power Artifact, and then also is a very playable counterspell on top of that.
You should definitely include it. If you're not including it, you're wrong.
Sure.
I love it when we have takes that are like, no, you not playing this is wrong.
That's kind of funny that you mentioned. Honestly, I've been on Muddle like 100%, and I don't know. I guess like historically I've had pushback, and maybe that's just why I had that assumption. But like, I mean, yeah, clearly looking at your list, like you all run Muddle, and of course it's you recommend it. So
it's the only way outside of Intuition to get Power Artifact. So not including it is just stupid. So I personally would say that if we had an enchantment tutor, a blue enchantment tutor, which is something that does not exist, only in my dreams, but if we had that, I would 100% include it, because you can get Rhystic, Mystic, Remora, and then of course Power Artifact, and also
Why search for a Rhystic study when you can search for a Steel enchantment to just take somebody else's?
I'm not gonna lie. I have to say, I hope that, I know you want a mono blue artifact, or I'm sorry, a mono blue enchantment tutor to exist, but I really hope it doesn't, because it would just make everyone else better at getting Mystic Remora and Rhystic Study into play, and please God, we don't need more of that. I will happily pass on that bullshit.
Yeah, we need some sort of heavy restriction for sure.
Narrow, like if you control Urza, search for a two mana.
Metal craft
equals the number of snow-covered basics that you have.
I'm writing that one down.
That's how we have to template all the new cards we want for Mono Blue, because anything that's printed that makes Urza better just happens to also make every other good deck better. Like, Fierce Guardianship is exceptional in Urza, but it just also is great in every other 4-color,
amazing
5-color deck.
And all Thrasios decks, yeah.
So we need to add, Wizards, if you're listening, add snow-covered permanent stipulations. That's what we need.
All right, so I think that gives a pretty good bow on the end of interaction for sure. So let's move on to card selection and card advantage. This is kind of in the form of cantrips and tutors, but also how you generate card advantage in the form of actual cards.
Oh boy, the spiciest section of this podcast, perhaps, because I think all of us who play this deck a lot know that this is the sore spot for the deck.
Why is that? Yeah.
Why do you guys let it go?
And we move on. Yeah.
So you,
I mean,
you
he's
wouldn't
right,
think
he's
that
right.
of
Card
a
advantage is hard
mono blue
mono
deck
blue.
because like all the cantrips and stuff, but it actually comes down to what we talked about earlier: is that we are able to vomit our hand onto the board, and then there's times where we do not have a lot of things to do in the mid game because we can't draw into other cards. So of course we play the usual Rhystic and Mystic, and then the usual cantrips being Brainstorm, Preordain, and Ponder. And then I know that Keegan plays both all three Baubles, which also cantrip, but those are only cantrips. So we don't. What we are lacking is a card advantage engine, which most of the partner commanders are. So if you have Tymna, for example, or Thrasios, or Crom, all of these are card advantage engines in the command zone, which is something we do not have, which means that while other players, opponents, are constantly refueling their hands, there can be a point in the game where we are close to being hellbent.
To reiterate a previous point too in that regard, Urza's 5 mana ability is not a Thrasios activation, like not even close. So it's certainly tempting to just activate it like
Urza
a
doesn't
Thrasios,
count as
but
card advantage.
that is not exactly a great source of card advantage.
I mean, there will be times where you can get away with activating Urza because you don't have anything else to do, but those are fewer and far between. And when you're at that point, you're really very desperate. And like I was saying earlier, this deck does not top deck very well. So when you get to the point where you've barfed out your hand and you have some interaction left and not much else, top decking is not something we're super strong at because we have a lot of singular interaction. We have a lot of rocks. But we're really kind of light on cards that unto themselves are just bombs. So we don't have a lot of single card rips that we can just windmill slam and force the table to react to. Yeah.
There's a lot of air in this deck, and anyone knows, you need a good gas to air mixture to actually make it run right, which makes the top decking so poor. Most of our forms of card advantage will be, well, maybe not most, but they'll be mass card draw either for the table or yourself. So the 3 quality wheel effects in Windfall, Time Spiral, and Time Twister. If you were playing creatures, I suppose there's a consideration for Jace's Archivist, but that's worse than those, obviously. And I've seen people even play something like Time Reversal, which is much worse, but I don't know, defensible, I suppose. And then you have your chunky draw in Recurring Insight, which seems on its face quite poor, but when you generate as much mana as you do, the ability to, for 6 mana, draw 14 cards is pretty damn good, and also gets them into your hand right away.
Yeah.
Because there's a real distinction in between the incremental card advantage, on-board card advantage, which would be represented by something like Mystic Remora, Rhystic Study, and to a lesser extent, a Planeswalker like Narset.
Yeah.
Versus something that gives you the cards right this very instant.
I really need to say that I think not running this card is wrong. As we've been saying a whole bunch in this episode, but the reason is that there are just not very many things that you can do in mono blue that, without being a combo card or some kind of interaction, just force the table to have it or do something about it. And this is one of those bomby cards. You point this at a player with a lot of cards in their hand, and you kind of force the table to have to answer it. Because I honestly, anytime I have ever resolved Recurring Insight, I think I have won the game. I can't think of a time when I didn't draw 8 to 14 cards and proceeded to lose. Right? That's right, exactly.
That would be one of those times.
But that's someone else drawing that many cards, and then of course they're going to win, right? So it's the point is, this card doesn't read you win the game, but drawing that many cards is very difficult to lose once you have done it. So it's one of those things that I can't really get over cutting because we just don't have a density of payoffs in this deck. And when you top deck this card and you can cast it, you should, because if people don't have it, you're going to win, or you're going to have an answer to whatever they're trying to do to win, for sure.
to speak to our desperation of card advantage, really the only things that I imagine we all play would be Fact or Fiction, Dig Through Time, Recurring Insight, and the Wheels. I have the addition of Paradoxical Outcome, which is much more niche and not... It's different. It's different for a couple of reasons. But of the new cards, I've elected to test Seagate Restoration, which is a terrible piece of card advantage, but it just shows how far you have to reach to get something which could be playable. And that it just acts as a land is upside. I can't comment on its effectiveness very well, but it's clearly much worse than any card advantage spell.
I'm going to keep harping on this, but
into the rest
I don't
of the
think
deck seems valuable to me.
I agree with all of this. I think it's worth harping on how important it is to have live top decks, and Seagate Restoration is not a live top deck, right? Like, if your hand doesn't have cards in it, you draw this card, it's not going to get you more cards. So it's a problem in that way. Like Recurring Insight, like your hand is empty, you at least have a prayer with Recurring Insight of getting back into the game, or with Time Spiral, or with Windfall, or with Twister. Like, all the other cards we play, if you talked up them, you're like, thank God, right? Like, you can now do something. This card, no, not at all.
Yeah. I've experimented also with the instant speed draw X cards. I think the best of that is Pull from Tomorrow as blue X to draw that many and then discard one. And these are a poor rate because it's just you don't get a ton of cards for the mana investment. You get X -2 or 3, and then they also are pretty bad early, which is unfortunate. The advantage is that if you're in a sandbaggy metagame, you can hold up all of your mana and then do that end of turn, and then I suppose pray that it resolves. But if it doesn't, at least you can untap and try and do something else scary. I believe all of us have cut those. I know that I have. I also see Blue Sun Zenith semi-regularly as a hard outlet. I know we've discussed that that's not necessary, and so instead I would just play something that...
Yeah, I agree. Look, like people argue about these X draw spells all the time, and for 6 mana at instant speed, you draw 3 cards. Versus at 6 mana with Recurring Insight, you're going to draw 14 cards? What? Like, it's not even remotely comparable. Like, the fact that you can do it on your turn or do it on a different turn is, like, sometimes relevant, yes, but the discrepancy in how many cards these two spells draw is massive. It is massive.
Yeah, that's also a reason why I cut Dig Through Time. Of course, it has Delve, and as Keegan said, you can feed your own graveyard with Codex Shredder. But I found it to be way too expensive in most games because like we don't have we don't play Tassigor or anything. We're not in that remark a Spellslinger deck which fills the graveyard very quickly. And then I found myself to be in the position where it was like 5 mana or 6 mana, and then it got countered, which really hurt. And I've already exiled cards. Yeah, so that was definitely a card I didn't find to be as strong as other people do, and that's why I cut it. I added another really good card for it, which is Steel Enchantment, and I use that to, of course, steal Ristics or Mystics, or even Sylvan Library, which is also...
That is a
Hey man, Smothering Tide, getting treasures and not having to crack them is pretty sweet.
Getting Mox Sapphires, actually, yeah.
Actual Mox Sapphires, yeah. So, we've touched on a lot here, and to wrap up this section, I want to talk about one of our later categories, which is tech cards, and then we'll finish it off with any kind of final remarks. So, what kind of tech cards are you guys running?
Okay, so my personal pet card, I would say, for the deck is Phyrexian Metamorph. It's a pretty new include to the list because we cut Ethereum Sculptor, and I definitely wanted another creature in the deck because without that, there wouldn't be any reason to actually stay on UPS. And then I found myself to be in a position where I wanted to copy people's, or actually I wanted to steal people's card advantage engines, which are mostly creatures, so Thrasios, Tymna, Crom, Niv-Mizzet, etc. And yeah, well, that was not possible because there wasn't a good card to do that, except for Gilded Drake. And then I opted for Phyrexian Metamorph, which really puts in a lot of work. So you can tutor it. It costs only 3 mana. You can copy a Thrasios. You can copy Niv-Mizzet. You can copy. I've copied what's it called? Bob, which won me games. Like in my opinion, it's very strong and it helps to fix the card advantage problem. But of course, you rely on an opponent playing a card advantage engine, which is, of course, something we usually do not want, but we also cannot stop most of the time. So we can as well use it for our own benefit.
The fact that it also taps for mana because it's an artifact is like, that's greedy. I love that.
The cards that I run, which may not be as stock and would see variance amongst the lists, include Dig Through Time. I actually end up searching that a good deal in games that run late with something like a Merchant Scroll, just because it digs, no pun intended, very far. Another piece of card advantage which I run, which others may not, is a Paradoxical Outcome. Things do have to be going all right for it to be good, but in a situation where you can draw a bunch of cards with it, it happens to not only be free, but it usually nets mana while drawing you a bunch of cards, which is in itself phenomenal, and it plays a okay role at protecting Urza and or some of your other stacks pieces. Otherwise, perhaps the spicy ones I have are lands. Seagate Restoration is by no means an established good card yet, but giving it a fair shake. One card which I do really like is Teleria West. As we've said, the density of tutors in mono blue is severely lacking, and so I'll take pretty much whatever I can get there. Finding Mana Crypt is usually the way that I go for it, but it does also allow you to find the hyper powerful card Tabernacle, as well as the very useful card Inventor's Fair and Mystic Sanctuary. And in certain scenarios where I'm looking to protect a combo, you can also find yourself with a Pact of Negation, which is useful. Otherwise, enchantments-based Steel Enchantment is just amazing, although that's perhaps hardly a pet card at this point. And Legacy's Allure I play because Thrasios is everywhere, and this deck plays really well with Thrasios.
I love that. Like, our best thing is Thrasios, which is true and awesome, and I agree is another good reason to play Legacy Allure and Phyrexian Metamorph. Before I say something really spicy, which I think I'm about to do, and I think we maybe alluded to it earlier. I want to say one thing about a land that you mentioned, because I don't know if we're going to have another chance to talk about this, but Mystic Sanctuary, in the theme of saying people are wrong that we've sort of been on throughout this episode, not playing Mystic Sanctuary is wrong. You are wrong if you are not playing Mystic Sanctuary. The reason is that this card recurs all of your most relevant interaction and tutors and ability to whir stuff onto the battlefield and can be fetched. The fact that you can polymorph, get it countered, fetch it back to the top of your library at end of turn and try again the next turn. This card is amazing. The number of situations it's gotten me out of is just mind blowing. The fact that it's an island and can be fetched. It's I cannot imagine playing this deck without that card, and I feel like I needed to say that on this episode if I said literally nothing else. Yeah.
Mystic Sanctuary makes Intuition very good, as well as making all of your fetch lands incidentally into Noxious Revival, which is valuable.
So back to Spice and tech cards. I think there are 2 or 3 that I'm probably on, but not in Polytyrant actually. So I have been playing UPS more recently just to explore more space and to try to do something about what I have called or think is like the turbo stacks meta on Play DH sometimes. Turns out there are a lot of stacks decks you can play that are cheaper than the fully powered decks, and I think a lot of people when playing in paper tend to go toward these. So I've been seeing a lot of that recently, and two cards that I really like. One is Emergence Zone. We were talking about being able to win at instant speed earlier, and this card turning on Polymorph and other cards at instant speed is nuts. It is great. I love this thing. It feels pretty free to me for the most part because I'm not running very many other cards that don't create blue mana, and otherwise, being able to surprise someone, by winning at instant speed has been amazing in my testing so far.
Yeah, I have to deal with that. I've been experimenting with Emergence Zone even in my 3 or 4 color decks, and I've been pretty happy with it.
Yeah, it just enables a bunch of things that people are not ready to play around. I mean, the fact that we were talking earlier about Torpor Orb, and being able to cast hate pieces at instant speed is also super good. If you just randomly have this and you have an answer or a way to respond to something that for whatever reason you haven't played out, and we can get into the details of why that might be when we get into piloting, but being able to play that stuff at instant speed is sick, and it completely blows people out. Other spicy card that I'm on that I think is probably too spicy for most people. I have started to play in the UPS build Deadeye Navigator. The reason is that it interacts favorably with many of the other creatures we've already talked about, Spellseeker and Phyrexian Metamorph being really amazing examples. But the other thing that it does that is sort of low-key sick is it ramps with Urza and the constructs, and this card on its own has been pretty interesting to watch people try to respond to it, because people either misunderstand how the Soulbind trigger works, or it doesn't occur to them that for 1 mana you can start ramping constructs, because every time you get another construct you can make another mana. So you can play this out, and if people don't fight over it, you can wait and you can start building a whole bunch of constructs, and at the end of turn untap with 20 power or more on the board, and suddenly be in this position where you can win the game. And I didn't expect that when I started playing the card, but I've been finding it to be super spicy.
The Tender Shoot Dryad of Mono Blue.
That's too spicy for my blood. It's interesting because a couple of the cards that you mentioned, I think, benefit from a play group which is not experienced playing against Urza. So you mentioned that you have a lot to gain with people not understanding Soulbond triggers or what have you. And I think some of this applies to both Deadeye Navigator and Emergence Zone, in that a savvy opponent will clearly not realize that you just passed the turn for no reason, and will recognize your posturing and hold up interaction accordingly. Whereas someone who is perhaps newer to, if not the format in general, at least Urza, playing specifically against Urza, may not respect that as much and be like, well, they passed the turn, so I'm free to dump out some stuff and give yourself an opening. And that can work. That can work in some metagames, but I have a resistance to playing cards which are at their best when your opponent's
I think that's a fair overall philosophy.
I agree. I don't think that this card particularly excels when you can pass the turn with it. I think it's more that when you play the card, the thing that goes through most of your opponent's minds is not, he's going to make 1 mana constructs, right? That's the part that I think is pretty good here. If you play it and you have a Spellseeker, obviously people know what you're going to do, right? It's really clear. But the fact that you can play this card and Soulbond it, and then you can blink stuff to obviate single target removal, or you can just try to get value out of it, has so far been pretty decent. Now, all of that said, I completely recognize that this is a very, very, very spicy, ridiculous take on this deck. And at this point, I'm trying to jam cards like this to try to, as we were talking about earlier, try to increase the density of sort of must-answer cards, or cards that can incidentally win on their own. And this card does that. The fact that you can blink Urza and suddenly have a whole bunch more mana and a whole bunch more power is really good. The fact that with Spellseeker, it just automatically wins the game because it finds you the 2 combo pieces that you need to win the game. The fact that with Metamorph you copy, right? Like there's a lot of value that you can squeeze out of this card. Even though I'm not convinced I would take it to a tournament just yet.
I will say that Urza is very forgiving for a wide range of deck building choices because the commander itself has such a powerful ability, makes so much mana, that if you just have a personal interest or a play style which wants you to be playing particular cards, then you can slot 3 to 4 of those in as flex slots and they'll be fine. Like you're not gonna see an enormous drop off in win rates just because you swap out a couple things, because the rest of the deck is already so good that it just allows you quite a bit of deck building leeway. Nice.
And I think a lot of players are kind of defined by their tech cards, and it's great to mention them. And I think Deadeye Navigator is certainly spicy. So it's I'd be really happy to see that played against me, to be honest. So yeah, let's move on to piloting advice. And we've broken this up into kind of stages of the game, but also general advice unique to Urza. So let's start off with the early game. What are we trying to do? How are we doing it?
I think the most important thing we have to do in the early game is get out Urza probably on turn 2, turn 3 at least. So he's ahead of curve and we can use his ability to ramp even more.
Yeah.
In the first turn or two, what I'm looking to do is develop my mana to advance, and it's hard to keep a hand that doesn't have mana ramp that's playable on turn 1 or 2. So look to mulligan to try and find that, as well as use any extra mana I might have to develop cantripping or card selection to fill in any gaps that your hand might have. As a piece of piloting advice, if you have your turn 1, 2, 3 plays all set, you may just not want to fire off a Preordain or a Ponder yet. You may want to save that until the game develops and you know what you're looking for. Unless you're just saying, well, the only card in my deck that I would want right now is a Mana Crypt, it may be worth hanging on to that, because after you cast your Urza, you always have 1 extra mana kicking around, and at that point you could play something. So think about the first maybe 4 turns, how you intend to spend your mana, and if there's an opportunity to use your cantrips later, if your hand is already good enough, then maybe hold on to those.
I will agree with that. I think that you need to really read the table. So this is getting into, like, I really put a premium on hands that have a one mana interaction spell plus ramp, because it gives you the opportunity to make a decision about, like, ramping, it precludes you having to make decisions about whether you ramp or hold up interaction, because as long as you can get to Urza, you will, and it resolves, you will have 1 mana afterwards. So I love the 1 mana interaction spells. As a matter of fact, like, I'm playing, I think, both Pongify and Rapid Hybridization instead of Reality Shift, just because they're both 1 mana. For this exact reason, it just increases the density of hands that you have, where you can ramp right into Urza and then still have a single mana available afterwards to do stuff. And I think that, playing Urza otherwise has to be a decision about, does this move my game forward, or will I just lose if I don't have the opportunity to respond in the next 2 or 3 turns? And that's the thing that I've been really struggling with, I think, recently, is that, if you might manage to disrupt somebody in the first 2 turn cycles, on turn 3 you play Urza and you don't have a piece of free interaction or something, and then someone else just wins. Yeah.
One last note, I think, for early game is Flash is banned now. So developing early is a lot more safe, and ultimately affects your late game a lot more positively than you might expect. So I think this is kind of a trend I've seen recently, where, like, I don't see a lot of the early removal spells and early interaction that was kind of specifically more for the Flash meta. Like, I still see that around in Decklists, and, like, it's more proactive to develop into Urza early.
Absolutely. If you're not pursuing your own game plan and you're playing
Yeah.
entirely reactionary,
Yeah.
you're not going to
I
win.
had to
You're
learn
just
that
gonna
the hard
lose
way.
more
So when I
slowly.
was progressing into CDH, I played Urza more Staxy, if you want. Yeah. And then, the only thing that happened is that I had like 1.5, 2 hour games and I still couldn't win. And then I gradually became more proactive, where I'm at a point now that I think ramping out Urza early and kind of not being the not policing the table, but like focusing on advancing your own board state makes the deck much better.
Well said. So at this point, I guess we have Urza in play. We've used a significant amount of cards in our hand. It's around turn 2, turn 3. So this is, I guess, where the mid game starts. What are we trying to do now?
I'm trying to stick an orb effect as soon as I see people with lots of permanents that they have tapped down to do something, like try to develop further or whatever else. I mean, this is really the part of the game where you want to start to eyeball your orb effects and your disruptive elements, because they're not very good, like jamming them super quickly. People just don't have that many permanents. They're not going to tap them. They're also not very good to jam into untapped mana, because often people will just play the waiting game, and like with most stacks effects, it's not really correct to remove this unless you need to win. And when you can just hold up your mana, you can just win around it. So I tend to try to sandbag, along with interaction, I try to sandbag those orb effects for turns or positions where people have tapped down a lot of mana, and then I really like to jam them because it completely clogs the game and stops most decks from winning.
It's important to get your first mid-game either card advantage or disruptive piece to resolve. And this is where a lot of the piloting skill comes in a way that we can't really help you with, because you just need to channel your inner poker player and feel out the texture of a room to determine if someone is intending to interact with you, because you'll often want to develop this after Urza has come out, because Urza unlocks so much of your mana. So after that's happened, that's when you want to start doing your winter static orb type things. And if you have a prediction that that's just going to immediately eat a removal or a counterspell, then that's a highly wasted turn. Naturally, if you have literally nothing to do, it feels kind of bad, but better that they have let their 2 mana rot than to have used an effective removal spell on yours. Also, this is the time when other people might start be trying to win, but it's unlikely that you will.
That's
because
a huge
Urza is
point.
not amongst the fastest decks. You're probably looking till turn 5 or later to actually win. So at this point, if you can, sandbag your interaction to stop them from winning, as well as to protect your Urza in a disruptive piece. Also, a note on when to use your resources. In the mid-game, I think that it is a good idea to use your interaction to protect your own permanents, be they disruptive or incremental card advantage, because you'll need them to last for a little while. But that's not a luxury that you have in the later stages, because if I spend my Swan Song and my Flusterstorm protecting a static orb, great, it's still around, but then I don't have these to stop someone from winning later. So you can be a little more cavalier with your interaction to protect your own things in the mid game, but after this point, sometimes you just have to bite the bullet, let it die, and save your things. So just know when you're free to protect your own spells. And when
I think in general, I agree with that. I think there are times when sticking and protecting a stacks piece will just naturally win you the game, and that is when it becomes clear it's like a back to basics or something. It's shut off everyone else at the table, and you're maybe not really doing anything, but neither are they. Great time to try to protect that. If someone tries to remove it, generally you will know that they will be winning if they succeed. The other thing is that these are, sticking one of these effects and riding it to a win is really, really good when you have a path to a win as well. So I also will tend to agree that if you have like a tutor or even if it's conditional, I would absolutely try to jam one of these effects because most other people will go faster than you will to win, and then spend whatever other cards I might have like defending that until we have like a window where we can tutor and try to go off.
Yeah, those are some great points for sure. I think kind of maybe a silent point that came out of that discussion is like there is like a very gradual change from mid to late game, and I think it's mostly because the stacks pieces are largely effective at both of those stages of the game. So maybe let's go a bit more into that.
Someone wanna?
Was that a yeah? Sorry, go.
I mean,
Okay.
I'm sorry.
I'm just waiting for Eisen because
it's kind of hard. So if you have the stacks pieces out in the late game, it's obviously it's really good to have them there. But also spending the mana to protect them is like it can hurt you from stopping another player from comboing off. Because like I personally had the experience that players were waiting out the game, playing land after land after land after land, leaving them untapped because they knew that the other players weren't able to go to win with the stacks pieces out until they were at a point where they had like 3 mana or 4 mana open and were able to cast a Thassa's Oracle into a Demonic Consultation, which is such a compact combo that often you will have to keep up the interaction instead of protecting the stacks piece at that point.
yeah, and I want to.
ideally, once you've moved into the late game, you have some way to gain advantage as turns go on, be that Rhystic Mystic, some onboard card advantage, or something that makes your mana unlocked while preventing other people's. So ideally you have that. If you don't, this may be a time to try and go find it. If you're going into the late game without a onboard way to take advantage of turns ticking by, it's probably a good idea to try and find something that does that. The other things that you're going to want to do there are to pressure players with your construct. You want someone else to try and win first, because it's rare that the first person who can try and win, unless they're doing it turn 1 or 2, is actually going to be able to punch through with it. So what you want to do is just beat the crap out of the player who you think is going to try and win first and force them to do it, and then have them go half-cocked, get stopped, ideally by the other members of your table. And then once that's happened, you now have an opening to pursue your own win. So try and use your construct and your mana attack pieces to create an opening where someone has to go off before they're ready, and then just do it after them. You can also make good use of turn order here. If you're beating up on somebody, try and beat up on, obviously, the person who used their life total over resource, but if it's ever a split decision, beat up on the person to your right, because then they'll have to go off and it will immediately be your turn right after.
I have 2 things I think are worth saying here, like as a heuristic or like a rule of thumb for when to go off. I think there, in general, like I have this philosophy of like there are 2 good times with this deck to try to go off. One of them is exactly what Keegan was pointing out, where someone else has tried to go off and you now get to, because someone else has been stabbed and people have expended stuff. Usually a great time to try. You don't want to be first ever. The other is when you know that you will not get another turn, or you know that this will be the only or best window or opportunity you have to do it. And I think that one is much more nuanced and much harder to ascertain, but there are some clear, some clear indicators. And the reason I'm saying that one now is because I think it also bleeds into something that I wanted to talk about later in this section about king making. Because you do play stacks and counter magic, you have to be really, really careful playing this deck not to king make. Like that scenario that Eisenherz was talking about, where he jammed he jammed a static orb effect, and slowly one player untaps their land and then just keeps playing land go and doing nothing else. Like that is dangerous, because you can't just ignore them, but you also can't try to go off, because you now are in this position where if the other players at the table are not hitting land drops, if you do and that player stops you or similar, you've just made them the winner, right?
So that's also important. On that note, it's important to note that we are not the grindiest decks. So if we are in a position where there's a lot of stacks out, let's say we have a back to basics and an orb, the game is pretty much slowed down to a point where turbo decks aren't that big of a threat anymore. But also, we aren't a big threat anymore because we can't do a lot if we don't have a card engine in play. So sure, we have mana available, but if we are not able to cast spells, we can't effectively use our commander to generate card advantage. So the best thing we are able to do is what Keegan just said, is to attack with our construct. And that's important to understand the fact that we are not a dedicated stack. We use the deck to deny mana, to open up a window to win in the mid to early late game.
There's something to be said also for how you're positioned versus how many risks you're willing to take. If you've set yourself up exceptionally well in the early and mid game, you have the option to play it safe throughout the late game and ride your advantage to build on it. But if things haven't broken your way, you got out of the gate a little bit more slowly, and it's only going to get worse as the game goes on, at that point you may just have to fire from the hip, because who knows, it might happen. And I know the big risk plays are often, they can be seen as king making, and it's fair to say that if you deplete people's resources and allow another person to win the game, your actions have aided them. But the best chance of you winning the game, if you're behind, are often not just to sit back and allow yourself to fall behind even more. Unless there's a way where resources could be exchanged to go and get back into it, it's hard to play from behind with this deck, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And if you are very behind, you're going to have to take more risks. A notable exception to this is if you happen to have a win condition and a wheel in hand, because then you can just try for the win condition. If that doesn't work, plan B, get a new 7.
Nice. Yeah, I mean that, and once again that like reassures the point that we made in the card selection or like deck building section, which is card advantage is kind of the weak point, and there's the most effective way of coming from behind is to have a solid card advantage system set up. Okay, so these last 3 categories, components of people hand, piloting, and not king making, I think we can largely skip on those for the sake of time. But so I think I'm going to give you guys the opportunity to make final points on piloting. Then we should go straight into the mulligans.
About the collusion point.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about collusion and then move on to the specific mulligan guide. And then after mulligans, if we are up to it, let's talk about matchups and metagame briefly, and then go into gut check and questions. Are you guys cool with that?
I'll try to make it really quick. So the first thing is with collusion. Urza, for some reason, gets targeted a lot. So what's really important is to be able to read the table and lay low as much as possible to not be the main threat of the table. That also means that if you have a tutor, for example, your Isochron Scepter or your Power Artifact, do not use it before you're not able to back up on it, because you will be targeted after tutoring, because we do not have unconditional tutors. We have to reveal the cards. And then also, which comes down to deck building and piloting again, my final remark is Turbo Urza does not work. Do not play it.
There's a lot of truth there, and it's not just a minor experiences. We did heavy card swaps, we did testing, we brought out like 12, just tried to go balls to the wall, make the deck a little bit like Godo, and I lost my win percentage dropped 10% by doing that. It was a bad idea. So you have to play tricky. You can't try and outrace people. Anybody who's played with me on a semi-regular basis or even at all will know that I love collusion. You need to communicate a lot while playing this deck because your board state often looks scary. You dump your hand out, you have a ton of non-land permanents in play often, and especially with the poly version, you really can win from nowhere. So you're often in a position which appears very dangerous. The weakest aspect that you have is often your hand size, which is hidden information. So it won't be readily apparent if you're not in a great spot. So what I would suggest is as you play this game, if people do point out that they're afraid of your position, don't be afraid to honestly represent it. I know all war is deception and you should represent yourself as in a good position sometimes, but people will tend to overestimate the position that you're in, and there's no reason to feed into that. I mean, for the play experience of your play group, don't just sit there whining about how hard your life is, but you do need to ensure that you communicate what your stacks are doing, especially for newer players. I can't count the number of times I've had players remove my orb effects and allow other players to untap only to see them win. In a 4-player game, it's likely that one of those players would either not care about your stacks because it's hurting the other 2 people more, or frankly devote resources to protecting them, even though they're not their non-land permanents. If you're not in a position to win and Urza has a Trinisphere out and you're just waiting to get back into the game, it's likely that you'll need that to stick around if you have any chance of winning. So if you're playing Urza, make allies. And that's so
I find this to be especially true just in general because Urza is a lightning rod. People will target you because 1, it's unpleasant to play against stacks effects, but 2, most people understand that you are running a lot of interaction, you do have things to say, so they will tend to try to proactively prevent you from having those things to say, especially if they're trying to play a fast combo deck or they're just trying to jam Thoracle. But you really need to play political with this deck because there are so many situations where what Keegan was just saying, so-and-so wants to remove your stacks piece and try to do something, but because everyone else has been sitting around shaping their hands, it's not very likely that's going to actually work. And so you frequently have to be like, look, I'm not going anywhere. Let's make sure that these other decks who have 7 cards in hand are also not going anywhere, is a really important strategy to playing this deck. You have to really tell people and explain to people that look, my hand is gone. I don't have anywhere that I'm going, but so-and-so is sitting over there on 6 cards because he can't play anything. That's way more dangerous if you remove these pieces. So don't do that.
Your construct also happens to be an exceptional bargaining tool, both as helping other people in reducing their opponent's life total and threatening people by reducing their life total. No one wants to take 7 a turn. So if you assure someone that if they are allowing your stacks pieces to stick around, all you're intending to do is just beat the crap out of one of your mutual opponents, they're likely going to be much more into this. And this is especially relevant if you're playing with pods with Tymna, because while you would traditionally need to leave up a construct as a blocker to prevent attacks with Tymna, if you communicate with the Tymna player that, hey, if you don't attack me, I'm free to swing out my big chunk of damage on one of your opponents, they're going to be more willing to do that, because the alternative is you don't attack and then they can't attack. So
I totally agree. I actually really love the Tymna players for those reasons. I try to pick and befriend the Tymna deck at the table for that exact reason, Keegan. I'm looking at Tymna player all game long, waiting to get an opportunity to try to barter in that way.
I do have to say, I've never experienced more levels of 20-minute sessions of politics and collusion than I have at QMTG meetings. We play long games, and half of that time is spent with a spell on the stack and 20 minutes of talking about the next 10 turns. So it's fun.
You want to try and get as much out of your resources as possible. Sure, I'll counter this spell, but if I can get the assurance that my buddy over there will get the next one, or at least something, he'll give me a reprieve from attacks, or he won't destroy my permanents. Try and try and bargain a little bit. You can get more value out of your cards than what's just printed in the text box.
Yeah, Urza HR. Okay, so I think if you guys have any final things to say in regards to piloting, let's move on to specific mulligans. Cool. So in this section, we've randomly generated around 20 hands and picked 3 that we think have notable points to be made. So first I'll list off the cards in this hand, and then let's go and discuss it. So in the first hand, we have Chromox, Winter Orb, Tidespout Tyrant, Mana Crypt, Island, Fierce Guardianship. So one note to be made here is this is the Poly Tyrant variant that we generated these hands from.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'll continue. So for me, that hand is it's really hard to evaluate. So you can have a turn 1 Urza, and then a turn 2 Winter Orb, which is very strong, of course. You will also have interaction available, because, well, you wouldn't want to keep Tidespout Tyrant in your hand. You would pitch it for Chromox and then go for another combo. But I don't think that I would keep it personally, because you're also hoping to top deck good, and yeah, that's not a point I want to be at, and then therefore I would personally mulligan that. And yeah,
this is a hand which I would keep. My game plan for it would be dependent on what I drew in the first turn. So if I had a blue card to pitch to Chromox, then I would pitch that and play the turn 1 Urza. As it stands, assuming I'm just drawing bricks, my game plan here is Island, Crypt, Winter Orb. Naturally, the Winter Orb doesn't do anything yet, but it's good to have out early. Alternatively, you could just play Land, Crypt, and then hold up Fierce Guardianship if there was something scary like a Carpet of Flowers that you wanted to counter on the first turn. So nice to have, I suppose, those options. But I'd probably develop the Winter Orb. And then on the second turn, again, assuming I just drew a brick, I'd play my second Island and play Urza then. Naturally, this is a little bit reliant on the top of your deck. Top decks
a little
great.
Reliant.
Basically, anything we draw here is playable, as well as if we play a turn 2 Urza, or again, assuming we draw something that we're interested in pitching to Chromox, a turn 1 Urza. Basically, any card in our deck becomes action, as well as if we untap on turn 3, make our land drop, and do nothing else. We have 2 mana from the Crypt, 1 mana from the Chromox. We also don't have to exile anything if Urza's played on turn 2, which is a pretty big advantage. 3 mana from lands, and 1 mana from the Construct, and we're basically almost ready to just hard cast the Poly Tyrant. The other important factor is that you have both Chromox and Mana Crypt as fodder for the Tyrant, which means that it becomes quite easy to put this through. So with below average draws, this allows us to threaten a hard cast Tyrant with counter backup fairly early.
Oh God!
As strange as that might be, and with better draws, it allows us to sandbag the Tyrant and then play those disruptive.
Okay, I've really struggled to listen through all of that, because I can't believe that either of the two of you think that this is a capable ad. Like, there is only one line. It is to either jam a useless Winter Orb on turn 1, or it's to try to jam Urza and then have nothing to do in both cases. Like, that is the worst possible position you could really be in with this deck. Like, jamming fast Winter Orb does nothing. Jamming Urza with nothing to do also does nothing. And you might have a lot of mana, but your entire strategy is hope. Like, I do not want my strategy of my opening hand to be hope. Like, that is so bad. I can't get on board with this. Keegan, I totally acknowledge and respect the reasoning that you're putting forward about keeping the hand in the aspirationally being able to cast Tidespout Tyrant, but like compared to the other hands we're going to look at, compared to the hands that this deck can get that are good, and compared to like being able to take a free mulligan and like go to 6 and like whatever else, like I would not keep this. I just don't want to pray that I top deck something knowing that we top deck poorly.
This hand with a single land can cast a turn 3 Tidespout Tyrant, which is a plan.
But if you don't get there,
I mean, it's hard to counter a creature spell. So I think that it has enough of a game plan just in that, as well as then also having the audible of just being a boatload of mana, that any card that you draw is good in this hand. I think that if you mulligan Mana Crypt hands, you're cursed to just not draw it anymore. You have to take you can't
even if there
I
aren't
like how
any
in
lands.
addition to hope we're now like into superstition as being reasons to keep this hand. Okay, I think I'm ready to move on to another hand.
Staple philosophy behind the mono blue cult, 100%. Hope and
Yeah.
Sure. So certainly a controversial one. Our next hand is Island, Aether Spellbomb, Polymorph, Pact of Negation, Island, Sensei's Divining Top, and Lodestone Bauble, right?
Okay, so you obviously taken these from Keegan's list.
Okay, so one freedom, I guess, is you can replace any card that you aren't running with, I don't know, a random card. No.
Any other card.
I mean,
personally not keep that hand for the simple reason that we do not have any fast mana. So, sure, Aether Spellbomb is cool because it can draw cards. Sensei's Divining Top is card selection, which is also nice. So is the Bauble, either Lodestone, Mishra's, or Urza's Bauble. But the fact that we can't do anything ahead of curve is pretty much that's for me. That's an auto mulligan. To be honest.
This I would send back. I think I would keep this on 5, maybe 6. But it's not great. Yeah, I might keep this on 6. The fact that you don't have a fetch land to go with your top means that it's just going to be rearranging cards. Lodestone Bauble being worse than Mishra's and Urza's in needing mana here is particularly punishing. It's nice to have the Polymorph, but it's not super useful. And also having Polymorph in this hand would encourage you to leave your Lodestone Bauble around so that you can do Polymorph things with it, which is not going to be possible because you really need to see more cards with this hand. So I would ship this back and probably keep it on 6.
This hand kind of seems sick. Like it kind of seems like it's going to do stuff, and it has everything that you might want conceptually, right? It's got some selection, it's got a couple of fast rocks, it's got interaction, it's got counter magic, and it has one of your combo pieces. But it's real slow. Like it doesn't do fuck all for like 3 turns. I mean, what, you're gonna play Island and then top, and then on turn 2 you're gonna activate top, I guess, in your upkeep, and hope as a strategy here to like hit some piece of ramp or something in the only 3 cards you can see with no shuffler. I mean, yeah, it just seems good, doesn't work, right? Like this Pact of Negation also is super awkward, and I actually find this counter specifically to be awkward a lot in protecting early hands, because like and especially in protecting Urza, because like if you're trying to cast Urza and you have Pact of Negation, it's really awkward because if you don't resolve Urza, you're not going to have the mana to use or pay for Pact, and you're just going to lose anyway. So I don't know. This has all the right elements but the wrong cards, I guess. So I would also throw it back.
Is there a hand size that either of you would keep this hand on?
Yeah, I generally don't mulligan lower than 6. So if I got this on 6, I would probably keep it. Yeah.
I think on Sinivi's point, the
Yeah,
putback here is
100%.
the pack.
I agree.
Just because.
Yeah. The rest of your cards are in some form, card advantage, I guess, and you want to, especially if you're already on 6 or 5 possibly, you want to be keeping those. So yeah, definitely packed goes.
God, and just think about how much better this is if this is like a bauble or any other 0-drop other than Lodestone. Like, geez.
well, there's some cards which are definitely better here.
Oh yeah. that'd be okay, yeah.
That would make this hand much better.
That's Hope talking.
Hope is typing up a lot in this podcast.
So we actually came to a consensus there, which is great. I think so. I guess to move on, our last hand here is Trinisphere, Mana Drain, Grim Monolith, Mox Opal, Land, Preordain. Can we keep this?
Okay, so personally, I would keep that hand. For me, it would be turn 1 Preordain and Mox Opal, turn 2 Grim Monolith into Trinisphere, and then turn 3 Urza. Sure, there wouldn't be a lot to do after that, but also there wouldn't be a lot to do for your opponents after that. And then that's also 3 cards we haven't currently seen, and we also have the top deck manipulation with Preordain, so I would definitely keep this hand, yeah.
I would also keep this hand. It has just very good card quality. It also has enough artifacts to make your Mox Opal live, which is going to be very important. It feels bad, and I think that the reason that we kept this hand around was because this is a hand in which you're not developing Urza before your disruptive pieces. You're going to develop your Trinisphere first. But then it does leave you with 3 mana, hoping to then on turn 3 have had a land in those 3 draws and looked at more with Preordain to play your turn 3 Urza behind Trinisphere. And from that point you can use your Mana Drain to prevent people either interacting with Trinisphere or trying to go off on their own, which would be hard through Trinisphere.
So this hand is really interesting to me. I think it really depends if I whether or not I keep this hand completely depends on the pod and my read of the pod, I think. Just because like I love jamming turn 1 Trinisphere or turn 2 Trinisphere. Like, don't get me wrong. I think this is super powerful just in the fact that you can turn 1 Preordain, turn 2 Trinisphere, and then turn the Opal on, like, and then have the ability to like you said, follow it up with Urza. All of that is very likely given how many cards you're going to see plus the Preordain. The thing is, after you do that, you are really going to sit around for a while, right? Like you're in this for the long haul. So if I'm playing against like decks that I know that break over the long game, like if I'm playing against like Kaiser Kima, Food Chain or something, like this is a great hand because there's no way they're getting out of this at any point. If I'm playing against like what you mentioned earlier, Keegan, if there are like multiple mid-rangey decks, if there's like medium decks at the table, or multiple Thrasios decks, I think this is generally just kind of a bad deck or a bad hand against Thrasios decks, because those decks are going to play Thrasios for 3 mana and then just sit there and activate Thrasios around Trinisphere and like not give a fuck, and they're going to hit way more card selection and card draw than you are, and they're going to win. So yeah, I think it really depends. I think most of the time.
Yeah.
This is also a hand that benefits greatly from earlier. I mean, Trinisphere in general is much better.
Yeah.
If you're early in turn order. I mean, any card is better if you get to develop it first. But if you can get this down before people have gotten a chance to get more than one dork in play.
Yeah, I was 100% going to say the same thing. If you're playing first, this is 100% keepable because you have the Trinisphere going into your opponent's second turn rather than it going into their third turn, which is huge, especially if they're trying to resolve a card advantage engine. And also, I'm definitely always looking for an opportunity to land my commander without any interaction or any particular trouble. And Trinisphere into Urza is, I think, a great sequence. possibly a notable exception to Keegan's rule, which is where you kind of want to play your stacks afterwards.
Yeah, it's great here because it's a defense grid.
Trinisphere in general in this deck is I have a hard time believing that people were playing without it. It just is so strong for what this deck wants to do because you can turn it off when you need to, and like when you're trying to win, or like if you're getting ready to, you sculpt your hand and then bouncy boy around it. It just is like one of the better cards in this deck in my opinion, because like you don't need to go that fast, and most of the other decks in the format are not designed to play around Trinisphere. So
I'm in full agreement. This was, I believe, included in the day one version of UPS. Yeah. It's not in all of the versions. A notable exclusion is a video that West Coast Commander came up with, where instead of Trinisphere, they played a Tangle Wire as an early game piece of disruption. I think Trinisphere is a lot better than Tangle Wire. Notably, also, two of your combos still work in Trinisphere. Power Artifact Grim Monolith is barely affected by it at all. So that's just phenomenal if you can punch through it. And in rare circumstances, well, maybe not super rare, in certain circumstances in which you have an extra 3 mana for your ISO Rev combo, it does work. It's so hard to say when you should and shouldn't tap Trinisphere. From personal experience, I barely ever tap Trinisphere. But a good way to gauge that is look at the faces of your opponents, and if they seem devoid of life, just keep doing what you're doing.
So yeah,
it's a man after my own heart. Being that I play Heliod too, that is definitely a way to play stacks. Like if your opponents are just wearing their despair on their face, you are doing it right.
It's a good politic tool as well, Trinisphere. If somebody develops a number of scary permanents, then you can look at someone, and something people like to say is, hey, could you tap down that Trinisphere? Make sure that they give you a concrete list of things that they're going to do specifically. Because if they just say something, maybe I can deal with them, and then they just cast a demonic tutor, it's like, yeah, I have something, and this counterspell will deal with them. It's like, well, that wasn't really worth it for me. But if you can extract from someone a promise that their turn will include spells which interact with your opponents, especially if this person is immediately to your right, then tap it down, have your opponents fight each other, and then it goes back online.
Nice. Any kind of general... we talked about our game plan, but are there any other general kind of components of a keepable hand that you guys want to mention?
Okay, so one thing I find important is to understand that we have an issue in the mid game with card advantage. So we can't be as aggressive with mulligans. So my general rule is to, if the 6-card hand is an absolute garbage, like no lands or only lands, I will probably keep it. Because it's really hard to come back from a 5-card hand.
Yeah, at the point where I'm looking at fewer than 6 cards, my plan is basically just to find mana into a wheel, because you can't win going into the mid game if you've been making steady land drops, because you'll just be on, well, you'll have to have been making steady land drops, but you'll just be like
exactly.
2 cards in hand, which is not, well, it's like liar's dice. You can't represent anything if you don't have enough resources, so there's no value even there. There's narrow situations you can claw your way back in, but basically once you're below 6, just try and rehash your hand. Like just dig for something that gets you back to 7. So then at that point, prioritize card selection.
One note on that. I think that card advantage is much more important than card selection in this deck, for the sheer reason that you vomit your hand into play and you're playing a lot of permanents. Like we talked about Teferi a little bit, like the new Teferi, that loots, right, and can do phasing things. And it seems like this card would be good, but it isn't, because we don't really need card selection as much as we need like actual card advantage. Much of our position is based on playing lots of permanents and then interacting with the stack or interacting with other people's game plans, and none of that really profitably draws you cards, and you don't really need to like have better selection because you've been vomiting so many cards into play. You need to have actual advantage. You need to be like actually properly drawing cards. Yeah,
you don't have enough cards in your hand to draw very many.
Yeah, it is kind of inherently a win more card. But what's great about it is like it does have it doesn't have kind of the usual downside of win more cards where it's purely a win more card. It is ultimately just a land if you need it to be.
I have a feeling that in the games, I've played over a dozen games now with this in my deck, and just that's the way she goes. I have never seen it in any of them, so it's hard for me to comment. But it also feels like a card to me that I would only ever cast as a spell 1 in 100 games. So it's just so hard to evaluate because I'm going to want to play it as a land, and it was swapped for a land almost always. So at that point, like you're including something for such narrow advantages, and it's hard to tell how advantageous those are in the first place.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then I've also seen the argument of, well, you can use Urza's ability, and then if you flip into it, you can cast it. Well, when you are at a point where you have 5 mana open and nothing else to do with it, instead of except of using Urza, you pretty much won't have enough cards in hand to make that card worth it or any good.
Do you know what the secret advantage of this is? Is that you can Mystical Tutor for a land.
Wow. What a play. Mystical tutoring for land. Yeah. You know what? Forget counter magic. Forget like actual time twister. Fuck that. No. I want a land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are not using Mystical Tutor for Seagate Restoration, you are pretty much just wrong.
Maybe if you have like a wheel in hand, you're just like, I just need 1 extra land. I have everything else. Again, you have to really bend over backwards to solve the situation.
Yeah,
I feel like doing this is straight up a flex. It is like the kind of play you make to like really just flex on the table. Like, yeah, you know what I could do? I'm in such an advantaged position. You know what? I would make that play after resolving Recurring Insight and drawing 14 cards. I would totally do that, right? Like, I would just flex on you.
I don't know if I would do that if I intended on keeping the hand that I had, because Mystical Tutor represents 1 of 3 instance and sorcery tutors, and that's just so premium.
That's what I mean. It's like the ultimate flex.
You just do it so you can show your knowledge of the rules.
Definitely
double-faced cards work.
You could also
definitely closing in on the hope section of this podcast.
use your Muddle the Mixture into a counterspell. It's also
Smart.
Yeah, but why not turn your Muddle the Mixture into a Merchant Scroll into a Mystical Tutor into a land, right?
Yeah, it's Mystical Tutor for the Muddle the Mixture, then Muddle the Mixture for the Merchant Scroll. I've demonstrated a loop.
Best tutor line ever.
Well, that's, I think, a great bow on the end of How to Mulligan. We have one last major topic here, but before we get into that, we're doing a special episode first, which is a gut check. And this is true to the original spirit of the gut check, where they have absolutely no idea, and we are not going to be preparing answers for this one like we have in the past few, as Keegan pointed out in the pre-show. So let me just launch it. The rules are you get a brief few seconds to think about it, and then we'll go in our regular order to give our answers. So what is the best non-artifact, non-combo card in the deck?
Time Twister.
Yeah.
I was thinking about wording this, and I think Time Twister in this context, you can't consider the fact that it is a part of your combo. But if you want to call it as a generic wheel, then that's totally cool.
3 mana, draw 7 does exactly what this deck needs so much. So I I know it's not very creative, so I'll just say Time Twister and or Mana Crypt.
Non-artifact.
Oh, Time Twister it is.
Yeah, Time Twister.
Actually, I think I would go for Cyclonic Rift. I feel like Cyclonic Rift has won me as many games as any of the other cards in the deck, to be totally honest. Like, this deck does a lot of stalling and getting the game to a place where people can kind of like slowly accumulate things on board, and you just get into the situation where people try to outstacks each other. And that card for me is a very frequent tutor target, and overloading it is a great feeling. I love overloading Cyclonic Rift, so I'll say Sea Rift just to diverge
Just
from the T-Twister.
One of my favorite mono blue combos is Cyclonic Rift into Windfall. It's gotta be.
Oh yeah,
gotta be out there.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Love it.
Cyclonic Rift into Windfall is especially spicy because then you draw like 20 cards.
Yeah. It's nuts if you can pull it off 100%.
There might be paying lip service here to Back to Basics as the only piece of stacks that doesn't fall under the artifact thing, but the trouble is Back to Basics doesn't hit, well, other artifacts or creatures, which almost every other deck runs.
Yeah.
So it's not the hard lock it may seem to be. Also, I guess special shout out to Rhystic Study and or Mystic Remora. If you're able to land them on turn 1 or 2, they're just insane.
The other card my brain actually went to was Mystic Sanctuary. Seriously, like I thought I did the same thing. I went like, okay, Time Twister, Cyclonic Rift, and then Mystic Sanctuary was the third one.
So I guess my next gut check is, if you had to choose exactly one card that's at a 100% must, which card would it be?
Mystic Sanctuary.
I can't in good consciousness tell people to go out and buy a Time Twister. It feels so bad.
Yeah,
so in that case, I'll just say Tabernacle.
I can't tell you to buy Twister, so instead, buy Tabernacle.
Nice.
I think that's pretty true.
Gilded Drake is like just one of those cards, man, that like I think I'm maybe a bit irrational with it, because I'm like, I struggle to put even like 4 CMC creatures into my decks because I know other people have Gilded Drakes. But,
I played Homeward Path for a while because of how backbreaking everyone Gilded Drake my Urza.
Yeah.
was.
I'm still playing Homeward Path.
I mean, I
Nice.
get it.
Christ.
I get it.
Yeah.
Oh, I mean, if we're talking deck specific, a 100% must for a polymorph deck is Tidespout Tyrant.
I mean, like, yeah. Outside of the really obvious stuff, I think that if you're asking about cards that you should splurge on that dramatically increase the deck's viability and power level, Mana Crypt and Transmute Artifact are definitely on there. Time Spiral also. These are cards that like are old, are hard to get, but that are absolutely like the core of the deck. Grim Monolith as well. You know, like some of these you're going to have to spring for, and they do make the deck consistent, and they do increase your density of wins, and they are like some of the best cards in the deck.
Yeah.
Amongst my 2 highest tutor targets are easily Mana Crypt and Time Twister, just because
I agree.
They mitigate the problems that Mono Blue has in ramping and in card advantage, respectively.
Yep.
Yeah, and you know, one easy tip to get your hands on a Time Twister is to just skip 4 months of rent and live on the street, and then ultimately buy your favorite piece of cardboard.
I don't even think 4 months of rent is...
I feel like after living on the street that long,
Toronto,
your favorite piece of cardboard has to be the one that's like over your head, preventing you from getting rained on.
It's the sign that's asking for free coffee. Yeah.
Again, I know we don't want to dip into budget, but I do want to suggest very briefly, if you can't afford a Time Twister or a Time Spiral, and you still want to do compact Twister loops, that's totally possible, and you can do it using Dueling Scepters and putting Narset's Reversal underneath, as well as just targeting your wheel effects, specifically, well, Time Spiral, which I suppose is cheaper than Time Twister, with Narset's Reversal over and over again. And lastly, you can take the ultra spicy Midnight Clock and Bounce Spell route when you go off.
Yep.
So if you don't have a spare $4 grand lying around, there's options.
And
Nice.
to be fair, it's not like all that bad. You know, it's one of those things where you're winning the game already anyway. You just need a way to do the looping. Like one of these cards will suffice. It's just nothing the rest of the time, and that's kind of why Twister is sort of irreplaceable. So.
All right, so let's move into questions. Before this episode, we pulled kind of an urgency the Urza server for questions they'd like to ask us, and we got 2 here. So let's jump into them. So Friend of Cats today says, in relation to Beltrandito's question, how do you respond to a meta that is highly resilient and active against Urza? Example, a Kess, Thrastimna, and Yisan Pod, or just running against decks that often are able to find and use silver bullet cards against Urza frequently.
Okay, I think we already dipped into that, but it comes down to collusion, I think. You have to make allies and lay low so you aren't the person being targeted. And then look for the best window. And also on that note, I would like to add that I don't think that Yisan is such a bad matchup for us. I think that Thrasios Timna midrange is very hard to deal with. And Kess, for example, is pretty easy to deal with. If you are on UPS, you can put a Grafdigger's Cage into play very early and try to protect it, because the deck runs very little artifact removal.
That being said, if collusion is like one of the best tactics of Urza, then I think Yisan is the worst possible matchup, because it's hard to say just don't use your deck.
Yeah.
Please don't activate your commander's ability.
Yisan appears to be a terrible matchup, and it will often make you lose. But I think that communication here is key, because in making you lose, Yisan will just kill itself. They have 1,000 tools to make your life miserable, and it's hard for you to win if they choose to target you with them. But at the time that they're basically just throwing you off the edge of a cliff, they kind of are jumping off with you as well. So it suffers a bit of the blood pod dilemma again, with Yisan is a great deck to make somebody else win. For deck building on how to get around a hateful metagame would be to move away from a reliance on commander-based synergies and add more cards which have high power level baked into them themselves. If this is the metagame you're describing, then I actually think that something like UPS might be better situated, and then just toss in some cards which have a good card advantage in them, like the mages to search for your pieces for good card selection. Perhaps something like Thieving Skydiver or Thada Adele to steal stuff and just be quality, and then you can put in some haymakers. I would lean more towards Consecrated Sphinx than Deadeye Navigator, but you have options.
Not me, man. Not me. I actually do agree, though, with you about UPS being a little bit better into those types of metas. Like, the fact that you can tool more with creatures and you can run things like Consecrated Sphinx and Deadeye Navigator is kind of interesting in that regard, but I can't, most of the time that I play blind, I would just much rather be on Polytyrant, because it gives you more ability to win out of nowhere and otherwise has all the same upsides. But if you know what you're getting into and you know that creatures are going to be really relevant, I think playing UPS is just a much better decision. Like, you will just have more longevity throughout the game. You get to play more ways to tutor the hate pieces that you need. You get to play Metamorph and Gilded Drake, and then you get access to stuff like Consecrated Sphinx, which is also just one of those amazing draw this card, play this card, win the game.
See, that's a card I do not play, because I've never seen it stick around more than like one turn, maybe two, before it gets targeted and removed. And I do not want to be the main target of the table.
Nice. Let's move on to the next one. So Fonzie from Mox Diamond Gaming asks, obviously playing mono blue means there's usually a greedy counterspell package included in the build. However, in this current combo-centric meta based around Dockside, would it be more efficient to build a faster build with a leaner counterspell package?
Okay. I feel like we talked about this a little bit earlier, but I have really strong opinions about this. We don't go fast. Like, if you want to go fast, Mono Blue is not the deck to do it in. Every other deck in the format goes under you. So trying to do something faster by omitting the strongest things that we can do in monocolor by leaning into artifacts and playing lots of disruption is just wrong. Like, you just can't go as fast as Turbo Dockside, Turbo Naws, and the farm decks. Like, we will never do it. And trying to do that just, like, gets rid of all of the really good stuff you can do that synergizes with artifacts.
So this is a very valuable question because it's something that we've experimented a lot with. Together, we've taken out large clumps of cards and replaced them with others. And it seems decent on paper, but it plays out very, very poorly because it forces you into a play pattern of having to go all in early. And rarely you'll have enough protection to actually do that. And once you fail at it, that's your whole hand and you're out of the game. To cite some data-driven arguments, the absolute fastest I was able to build this deck was to average Goldfish hands on turn 4.2, which is good, but not exceptional.
I mean, look,
highly unrepresentative of an actual game state, because naturally you can't just go off with no protection.
We do not have dorks. We don't have the best. So, of course, we do have rocks, obviously, but most of our artifacts only become good after Urza's out. So that's another issue. And then we do not have unconditional tutors. So whatever we get, so in Polymorph you are able to get a one card win con, of course, but whatever we get, we are telegraphing it to the whole table, and then we will have vomited our hand out, have telegraphed our win con, and then most of the time do not have the interaction to protect it.
Yep.
Nice. Well, that about wraps it up. If you guys have any final remarks or shout-outs, this is the time.
Okay, so I think...
you go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I would like to give a shout-out to the Urza server. Please join us on Discord. It's a very large community right now, and all the people are very nice over there, and they've accepted me and welcomed me very... what's the word I'm looking for?
Openly, perhaps.
Yeah, that's the word. And it's a lot of fun. We have very constructive discussions over there about new cards, about spoilers, and yeah, please join the server.
Similarly, thanks to everyone who's involved. It's been a deck building process as a team. We've discussed with a huge number of people to test out ideas. People will test new brews, new card packages, and then report back their findings. So it's a great place to get the new cutting edge technology. There were an absolute ton of questions that poured out when we asked, even at such short notice. And while we obviously weren't able to address all of them, we tried to bake in answers just throughout the whole of the podcast. So I hope you were able to find the answers to the questions you're looking for. And then lastly, I'd like to personally thank the Queen's Magic the Gathering group, because they are who got me into CEDH and have been a wonderful and supportive community throughout my time playing.
I'll say shout out to all the homies on the Urza server, obviously. Special also shout out to the two other Discords that I spend most of my time on. That would be the Heliod Discord, so shout out to all the mono white players who like to make people's lives miserable. Congrats, Michael, on your recent top 4. And then also shout out to the Food Chain and the Kaiser Yukima Food Chain Discord. Maybe more of a meme than a constructive deck building community, but hey, that deck is rad, and we've got some spice that I think makes worth calling out. All the people over there is they're a good group of people. So just wanted to say that quickly.
Nice. And if you guys have, you the listeners, have any questions in regards to what we've talked about, definitely reach out on either the Urza server or, of course, the Into the North server. So that about wraps it up for this episode. Thank you again to our excellent guests, and we hope you listeners were able to deepen your understanding of the deck and that you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to reach out to us with any questions, comments, or concerns, you can contact us on Twitter Twitter at Into the North Pod, via our email intothenorthpodcast@gmail.com, or on our Discord server, the invite link for which can be found in the description of this episode. An extra special thanks to all of our patrons who help cover the expenses of our show and allow us to work towards improving the quality of the podcast. If you would like to become a patron, we are at patreon.com/intothenorthpodcast. Thank you as always to the band Vox Cadre and our lovely podcast music, to Nate Slover for our equally lovely podcast logo, and to our long-suffering podcast editor, Roadkill. Next episode will be out in a few weeks. Until then, see ya later.